Hi, friends. Welcome to Exploring Light, another episode of Extra Bytes. And as I mentioned yesterday, that this weekend is going to be very, very special. And we never thought when we started this Extra Byte series almost 2.5 months back, it was mid of April, I think, when we decided and when we went live with the first episode. And today we are sitting with one of the very rare photographer who is not only who does not only excel in one genre of photography, he excels in two different and diverse genres of photography, unrelated kind of thing, and yet he just doesn't excel. He wins wherever he participates. He wins awards after awards in both the genres. So and let me take this moment to introduce him. Uh, just give me a minute, and let me just introduce him to all of you. I'm struggling with my, okay, yeah. So, and his name is Marsel van Oosten. He's a Dutch photographer specializing in nature and wildlife photography. So Marcel's images are known for its use of lighting, composition, color, and perspective. In his work, Van Oosten tries to simplify to get rid of the extraneous elements, and in addition to several first prizes in the International Photography Awards, Marcel's awards include the first prize in European Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition, first prize in the Nature's Best International Photography Awards, and he was a winner in the National Geographic and Photo District News Travel Photography Awards and the Travel Photographer of the Year Awards. His images are used worldwide in advertising, design, and magazines such as National Geographic, Geo, Audubon, and Science Illustrated. He lives in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, with producer and videographer Daniela Sibbing. Marcel van Oosten and Daniela Sibbing organize specialized wildlife and landscape photo tours and workshops for small groups to various locations worldwide. And I would like to add here that though he's been published, his images have been used worldwide in such prestigious publications. They have first time even been used yesterday on Exploring Lights, just on a lighter note, to just promote this particular session, Extra Bytes. So I would like to welcome Marcel. Welcome, Marcel, for accepting the invite, and thank you for accepting the invite, and thank you for accepting to come and share your journey in photography with us and all the viewers on YouTube.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And we have, let me introduce you to the panel. We have Himadri Bhoyan, who's a landscape photographer. Then we have Sandeep Mathur from Delhi NCR. We have Som from Bangalore, and we have Prakash. He is from Dubai. And so, Marcel, we would really like to know how and when did you get interested in photography? Was it from the childhood, or was it somewhere midlife? Or and again, what started first, landscape or wildlife in landscape? So whatever. So just share some story behind that.
Well, actually, so in the very beginning, I wasn't really very interested in photography at all. I first wanted to become a journalist, and I wanted to go to the Journalism Academy, and but there was too many people that wanted to go there, so then I had to find something else, and then I decided to study Dutch language and literature at the university in the Netherlands, and I studied that for 2 years. And then I thought it was too theoretical, too much reading. I had to read so many books, and then I noticed that I spent way more time on the looks of the work that I had to produce, and not so much on the contents. So that's when I decided to switch and go to art school. And in art school, there was many options for me to choose from, many courses. One of them being photography, but at the time I was absolutely not interested in photography at all. So I decided to not pick photography. So I picked graphic design and art direction. And those are the two courses that I majored in. So I have a BA in graphic design and art direction. And then straight after art school, I got an internship at a very large network agency, advertising agency, as a junior art director. And that's how it all started, because once I worked as an art director, I had to constantly pick photographers to photograph my advertising campaigns. So every time I came up with a new advertising idea, I had to search for the perfect photographer to shoot my campaign. And so over the years, I got to work with many, many different photographers, ranging from car photography to lingerie photography, cat food photography, you name it. And I have worked with people who photographed it. So that was obviously very inspiring, and also from an educational point of view, I learned a lot. And that's also when I started to appreciate photography, and I started to learn about the power of the still image. And once I started to enjoy it more, I also wanted to photograph myself. So then I bought my first little camera, which I then only brought on my travels. So every time I had a holiday, I brought my camera, and I started taking photographs of basically everything I saw. So I was like a photographic omnivore. I shot like travel and people and buildings and you name it. And I did that for a while, and but very quickly I realized that when I looked at my own photographs, I could instantly see that they were very bad. So that was kind of frustrating, because in my work as an art director, I had learned so much from working with all these photographers that I knew exactly what a good photograph looked like and what a bad photograph looked like. And when I looked at my own photographs, they were mostly bad. So that's when I decided I really have to change that. So I started to get some books, and I bought some photography magazines, and then basically tried to teach myself the basics, so basically the technical stuff. And then every time I went on a shoot with a photographer for one of my campaigns, I started to pay more attention. So I started to pay more attention to how they were using light, how they were framing, how they were making their compositions. I also started to ask more questions, like, why are you doing this and how are you doing that? And this is also when I started learning about post-processing. This was a long time ago. So this was back in the days when Photoshop just came out. So that's when I started with my post-processing, was Photoshop 1. And so I learned a lot of the fundamentals and the basics during my advertising career, which lasted for 15 years. During those 15 years, I worked at several large companies, always with the same copywriter. And in the last 3 years, I had my own advertising agency. And that was kind of stressful. And I noticed that during those last 3 years, I was leaning more towards my hobby. So I tried to spend more and more time working on my photography. And at that time, the hobby got totally out of control. So usually the days started very early. I got out of bed and got my camera gear, got in the car, drove to a nature reserve, photographed sunrise there, then got back in the car, quickly drove to work to start the day. And that's when I realized that I actually liked the photography so much better than my actual job. And then obviously there comes a point where you have to ask yourself, do I want to continue with the job that I have, or do I want to change? And I realized that I would love to change and become a photographer, but it's super difficult to know whether you're actually good enough to make it in like a new line of work. So I thought hard about how can I figure out whether I'm actually good enough, because if you're just going to quit your job and then jump into this new adventure, you know, you might not make it. So I decided that I was going to participate in competitions. So I selected a couple of the major, so the big photo competitions, and I started entering my work. And the idea was that if my work gets through and gets all the way to the final round, that means that my work is better than average, and that means that at least there's a chance for me to make it. So I did that for a few years, and during those years, actually won several awards, and that was actually the push that I needed, because then I knew, okay, so if I manage to do this on a regular basis, that means that I must be doing something right. So that's when I felt comfortable enough to quit my day job and change careers. That's a very long answer.
No, but that's quite an inspiring thing, because somebody who's an art director in an advertising agencies and been there for 15 years and start your own business. I know everything is stressful. I know to a certain extent, even now, there would be moments of stress. That is how the life is. But you still decided to quit that and get into photography. And you also probably realized early enough that your photography is not good. So my couple of questions that come to my mind is that when you were in an advertising agency and you were hiring photographers or seeking support or getting the services from photographers, they were probably doing people photography, and you mentioned that all different kinds of fashion and lingerie and all those things. So you had seen that kind of all those genres of photography. So when you started with your camera, did you also start dabbling in this similar kind of stuff, or you were still directly into travel or nature or something like that? So first, one part of the question is this, and then second is that when you started kind of leaning more towards your hobby, when you were into your own business, you had your own agency, you said, and that time, what were you trying to shoot?
So in the very early days of my photography, I really didn't have a clue what I liked most. I was just excited to take photographs, and I just saw beauty in everything. So I was just photographing everything that I saw. I wasn't really focused on landscapes or animals at all. It was mostly just sort of travel photography and maybe a bit of landscape. The first thing I realized was that I didn't really like photographing people. It always made me feel uncomfortable. It was also extremely hard when I was working with photographers in advertising and we had to photograph people. That was super difficult, because at the end of the shoot, you have like a couple of 100 images, and then you have to go through them. And with people, it's just ridiculous. The tiniest little change in a person's face completely changes the expression, and so you end up spending so much time sifting through all the images and finding what you want. That's so much easier with wildlife. They usually don't have so many expressions, but especially I felt just uncomfortable with people, because I realized that people are extremely aware of the fact that you're photographing them, and then you have to like constantly talk to them because you have to like make them feel at ease. And I don't know, it wasn't something that I enjoyed. So that left basically only travel photography. That was the most easy one. And then in 2001, I went on a honeymoon with my wife, And that was, we went on a honeymoon to Tanzania. And until then, I had never been to Africa before. And in 2001, we went on a safari. And so that was my first safari ever. And that made such a big impact. From that moment on, I knew, like, oh my God, this is it. You know, this is the best I've done so far. This is what I want to do. So from 2001, I knew that this is the kind of photography that I like most. And if I look back, it only makes perfect sense, because even during my very young years, when I was still living at home with my parents, we always went out walking in forests, and we always liked animals. I always watched all the nature documentaries. So in the end, it was kind of predictable that I would probably go that way. But yeah, it took me that particular safari in Tanzania to make it all clear to me that was actually what I wanted to do. Yeah.
That's interesting. Again, one more question that you started. So it is very clear now that you seriously started with wildlife. So from Tanzania, and that is where your entire life changed in a way, took you in a different direction altogether. But you also started, probably when you said that you started shooting nature and travel, so you were already into landscapes as well. You were trying to shoot landscapes. So which was the genre which fetched you the first big award, so to say, that really boosted your confidence that yes, this is the one that you want to get into? Because not many people I've seen, very rare that people begin with winning awards and that is how they gain confidence. It's probably usually the other way around. First they gain confidence, okay, and then they start winning awards.
Okay. Yeah, no, for me it was the other way around, because I realized at a very early stage that photography is an art form, and so it's extremely subjective. And so if you show your images to your friends and your family, they will always be impressed. They always think you're very good. And so the feedback you get from the people around you is always going to be very positive. But I realized that these people, they mean well, but they cannot be trusted.
Yeah.
So that's when I thought I have to search for ways to get objective feedback. But I forgot your initial question.
Yeah. So which was the stream? So either was it wildlife or was it landscape that fetched your first?
Oh yeah.
First big award.
If I remember correctly, it was actually an image with people in it. So it was a portrait. It was a portrait of 3 young children that I photographed in the Himalayas. I once did a mountain bike trip in Ladakh. Long time ago. 2 weeks to the highest motorable road in the world.
Kardungla.
Yeah, Kardungla. Yeah. You've been there.
Oh yeah, many times. 8 or 9 times to be precise.
By car or?
No, done everything there. Bike, car, everything. So
okay, cool. Yeah, so I took that photograph on that trip, and it won an award in the International Photography Awards. And I think that was the very first one. But after that, I haven't photographed people much. And I think that the second award was, I think it was already wildlife. I don't actually recall. It's a long time ago. But in the early stages, I did both the genres very much. It was only after a little while that I started to veer more towards wildlife, and then back to landscape, and it goes like that constantly. I have no very strong preference, but if you put a gun to my head, I would probably pick wildlife.
So you already answered my next question. That was to be that where does your heart swing more, towards the wildlife or towards the landscape? Or let me rephrase the question. Let us say hypothetically, you come across a scene where there's an animal. Now, would you be tempted to create the wildlife image, and that animal is in front of a wonderful, beautiful landscape, Xtra, as a backdrop. So what would you be tempted to click? The portrait of an animal or the landscape with an animal in it, or with a landscape without the animal in it?
Well, that's a very easy question because I would always go for the landscape with the animal in it. Yeah,
All
because
right.
with the wildlife in it. So because that's in the end, that's what I like most. If I look at all my favorite images, most of them are similar in a sense that they have a beautiful landscape, and very often there is an animal in it. And if there's not an animal in it, there's usually a very small person in it. And I really love landscapes, but the negative thing about the landscapes is usually I miss something that brings it to life. Usually a landscape, it can be very static to look at. And then once there's something in it that's actually like a person or an animal, that instantly brings it to life. The other thing that it does is it adds scale, so that I really enjoy. It instantly shows you how big the landscape is, how big all the elements in the landscape are. And it also adds a focal point. So if you look at a landscape and there's like a person or animal in it, that's usually where your eye goes first. I also like that. So it prevents people from wandering through the image and searching for what's actually important. So so my ideal photograph is actually the combination of landscape and wildlife. Yeah.
That's fantastic. That's a wonderful answer. Thank you so much, Marsel. Anybody wants to ask any question, or should we, Sandeep?
Oh, I think we are waiting for the images.
All right.
Just one.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've always been fascinated by your tours and how you started Squibbon, right? Because every photographer that we've spoken to so far, no matter how famous they've become, but I think you're the only one who has established like a pretty well-known photographic company, which is Squibbon, right? And it has attracted the biggest names who have actually worked with you as well, right? So could you quickly tell us about how Squibbon began, and then now you're conducting tours to Antarctica and then deep heart of Africa, stuff that probably nobody else does, right? So across genres.
Yeah, so when I started my new career in photography, obviously the first thing is, the first question you ask yourself, am I good enough? But the second question is, how the hell am I going to make money in this new job? So that's a difficult one. I'll make a very long story short, but one of the things that my wife and I decided, because we always work together, that's one of the things we decided together, that when I changed career, that my wife Daniela, she also knew that she wanted to leave advertising, and so that already meant that we were going to think about our new life together. And one of the things we decided that whatever we were going to do in this new life, we would only do things that we really love. So that was very important. And the next step was to actually figure out how we were going to make this work. So we spent some time completely isolated to brainstorm together. And by that time, actually, we came across my first problem, and that was like, I wanted to become a wildlife photographer in the beginning, and but I didn't really have a portfolio. And obviously, if you want to make it work as a wildlife photographer or any photographer at all, you need to have a good portfolio, and I didn't have that. So then we first had to make a plan how to get that portfolio, and I wanted to be specialized in African wildlife. So that meant that I had to go to Africa and take a ton of photographs for many months in order to create a good portfolio. So we made a large plan and that plan was turned out to be extremely expensive. So then we had to find ways to be able to travel in Africa without spending all our life savings. And then we actually decided to make a book because we wanted to go to all these lodges, but we couldn't actually afford it because, as you know, all these lodges in Africa are super expensive. So we figured that we could make a book on safari lodges, and then we checked if there were already similar books out, and there were. And then we thought, well, all these books they only show safari lodges, and that makes very little sense, because if you go to one of these lodges, then you're more interested in what you can do at these lodges and not so much how the lodges look. So we decided to make a book about safari lodges that also showed all the activities, and the surroundings, so the wildlife, the animals, etc. And there was no book like that yet. So that's always good. I know that from our advertising and marketing experience, that if you want to be successful with a new product, you just have to make certain that you're the first one to have that product. So that's how it started. So I made a dummy of that book, and then we contacted all the lodges and tried to sell the idea, which worked. And then we ended up with a large project where we visited 8 countries in Africa, 48 lodges in total, and I photographed there for 8 months. And during those 8 months, so that's how I got my whole portfolio together. And then after I finished that project, I started sharing some of my images that I shot for that book online, and a few of those images I shot in Namibia. And Namibia at that time was not very well known, so a lot of people who saw those images that I posted, they were very surprised to see the landscape, and they said, "Oh, where is it? Never heard of it. I would like to go there." And that's when my wife and I decided, you know what, we could actually go back there and then just bring some people with us, and that would be a way for us to make some money while doing what we love. So we did that. I posted that online on Nikonians. That was the photo community where I was very active at that moment. And then I sold that trip super fast, and that's how it all started. And we realized, you know, this is something we can do. We can set up a tour that's specialized in all these this kind of trips. And you should realize that at the time when we did that was not very common. There was only a handful of companies in the world that did it. There was a handful in the US, a handful in the UK, and then apart from that, almost nothing. So we started at the right time. If you look now, it's very hard to find a professional nature photographer, whether it's landscape or wildlife, who is not doing tours. Yeah.
Thank you, Marsel.
No.
Thank you, Marsel. That was wonderful learning here. So please take us through your images. We all are eagerly waiting to.
Okay, so when we discussed beforehand, we decided to just show some favorite images of mine, which I will do. I selected a little over 40 of them. How much time do I have for that?
Don't worry, we have time. So just.
Okay.
Yeah, don't worry about time. Just go to your images.
All right, I'll just go through the images. Most of them you'll probably have seen, but I'll just explain what I like about them and why I'm showing them. So to also be able to tell you something about how the thinking process is behind them. So I'll go there now.
Yeah, that's great.
Let me change. Let's see. So.
Wow.
All right. So if all is correct, you should see this frame filling, right?
Yes, it is.
All right. So I chose this image to start with because this is actually the most important thing for me for what I do. This is a selfie that I made in the swamps in Texas, in the United States. this is the only way to photograph there. You have to go by kayak because there's no roads. It's just a big swamp, a labyrinth. And this is what it's all about, being outside in nature. So even on days when I take no photographs, or because it's too hard, or the weather is not cooperating, or the light is bad, this is always what I try to keep in mind. You know, I've been outside, I've been outdoors and enjoyed nature. Apart from that, this is also a very special place because it has the most amazing trees. I have another example of that. Here's another one. It's the same kind of trees, but in a different province. This is in Louisiana. You see me at work, and these moments are just magical. And in the end, this is the only thing that matters. So I mentioned earlier that Daniela and I decided that whatever we do, we're going to only do stuff that makes us happy. Those moments are the moments that we're at our happiest, when we're just outside and in beautiful scenery, enjoying ourselves. Now, there's no coincidence that I enjoy places like this because they have trees. I am a big fan of trees. So these are very iconic trees in Deadfly in Namibia. Everyone has seen them. This is what I mentioned earlier, that back in like early this century, when I started posting images like this, most people actually hadn't seen this. So they were like, is this real? And it looks like a Salvador Dali painting, etc. And but it is real, and it's one of my favorite locations, even now that it's like over photographed probably. And the reason is that it's so graphic. So there's this surreal quality. It's very, very graphic. And that's actually one of the key words for my photography. I like my images to be super clean and with very strong shapes, with very powerful outlines. And this location is exactly everything that I prefer in my landscape photography. Now, I went here I've been here like so many times, it's just crazy. And every photograph that I see of this place, I can show you on Google Earth exactly where the photograph is taken, because I know every single tree that's in this place by heart. Obviously, when you visit the place many times, it gets more and more difficult to be original. And for me, it was the same. Every year, it started to get more difficult to take an original photograph here. And but for me, funny enough, it works the other way. Most people were actually, most of my peers, so most of my colleagues, they were like, I don't know, I don't think I want to go to this place because it has been photographed to death. So for them, it was a reason to not go here because already so many photographs had already been taken here. For me, very often it works the other way around. I really like the creative challenge, because if you go to a place that is very well known, it takes so much more effort to create something unique. And it forces you to really think very hard about your artistic options. And that's actually how this next image came to be. So this next image was one of the winners in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year Awards a couple of years back. And this was photographed at the time when most people said, like, there's nothing more that you can shoot in that place. Everything has already been done. And that's when I shot this. So if people ask me what are the images that you're most proud of, this image is actually always in that list, because this is something that I created that didn't exist before. It was the only image on the planet that looked like this, and it is the result of pre-visualizing and of thinking hard about ways to create something unique.
Marsel, if we can stay on this particular photo.
Yeah, sorry. I'm going back now. Yes, go ahead.
So the light, is it, did you manufacture the light? Is it induced?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I should explain. Sorry. So yeah, so this place is very dry. It's one of the driest places on the planet. But every now and then there actually gets fog in the morning, very early morning or during the night. There's fog that comes from the ocean. The ocean is only some 40 or 50 kilometers away from this place, and the only thing that separates this location from the ocean is 40 or 50 kilometers of dunes. And every now and then there's fog. It's rare, but it happens. And so when I started thinking about creating that unique image, I instantly decided that it had to be something with fog, because already fog is quite rare. So if you get that, then already your image is going to be in that 1% of images. And then I realized that I had to take it a little bit further. And this idea actually started just from my knowledge shooting fog, like at sunset or sunrise. You can always see fog or mist better when it's backlit. So if you see mist somewhere in the early morning, it's always good to try to shoot into the light, because then you can actually see the effect of the mist much better. So that was in the back of my mind. But I also knew that at this particular place, there was no way for me to photograph that with the sun early morning, because the sun actually rises behind the dunes. So there's no direct sunlight in the early morning. It takes an hour or so before the sun appears above the dunes. So I knew that would not be an option. And that's how I started thinking about creating my own light. So for that, I had to actually be there before sunrise. And so that's what we did. So this was taken very, very early before sunrise, but it was also not pitch black. So it was, this was during the, nautical twilight. And I asked Daniela to hide behind a tree, and I gave her a very powerful flashlight. And I asked her to shine the light directly to the tree, knowing that it would create all these beams. So all the dark lines you see is actually shaded parts, and all the bright bits obviously is light. So then all I had to do was wait for the perfect time for the ambient light to be strong enough so that I could actually see those trees on the left-hand side. And then there was also a little bit of color in the sky. And that's the moment when I shot this. So there's a very critical timing. If you're too early, then it's too dark and you only see the silhouette of the tree with the beams, but no color in the sky and no background. And if you're a little bit too late, then you don't see those beams very much. So Daniela was hiding behind the tree, and I just shouted instructions in terms of how close she had to move towards the tree, and also the output levels of the light, because you can make it brighter or less bright. So that's how this was done.
Thank you.
All right. So this is another example of a tree. This is also an image that I really love. This was shot in China, in a place called Huangshan. A beautiful area, very unique mountains here. As you can see in the background, these shapes are very unique. You don't see that very often. And then this combined with these very typical trees that grow there. They're very photogenic, especially silhouettes, I think. And then this place is famous for getting mist after rain. So if there's rain, then usually you get this mist rising from the bottom of the valley upwards. This is what everybody always hopes for. So my first time I went there, I did a lot of walking. It's very big there. You can walk for a full day. So we did a lot of scouting. And then this is one of the places that I found where I thought that this would be such a cool image if there was mist, because if there's no mist, then this doesn't look as nice actually. And so I decided to stay overnight in a place very close to this location, and I'm basically waiting for the right conditions. So then one morning, when the conditions were very, very poor, so that means a lot of rain, we went out very early in the pouring rain, and we hiked all the way up to this location, and we stood there waiting in the rain and waiting for it to stop. And then once it did, immediately this whole phenomenon started. So that's when you suddenly saw the mist rising from the bottom of the valley. And this is also a good lesson that there's no such thing as bad weather. And even though it might be uncomfortable and you may not get what you want, but usually it's good to just go out no matter what the conditions are, because there's always something that might happen that you had not anticipated. And I was there alone with Daniela and our local guide. We were just photographing this by ourselves. There was no one else. Everybody, all the tourists were in their hotels, all waiting for it to get dry. And by the time they started hiking, this was already gone. And this is I love this image, and there's not too many of these around. It's only a year after I posted this. Suddenly, a lot of the big names in landscape photography all ran towards this little location. So now you see more images from this exact same spot. But again, trees. I love trees as a sort of a focal point in my images.
This is such a wonderful depth in it. Amazing.
Yeah. Thanks.
Madagascar.
So yeah, so more trees. These are dragon blood trees. This is from a relatively recent project in Yemen. So I knew about this place already 20 years ago, and it was high on my list. But this was photographed on a little island called Socotra. So Socotra is part of Yemen, and it's in the Arabic Sea. It's actually closer to Somalia than it is to Yemen. But it's so isolated that almost everything you find there, whether it's wildlife or trees or plants or flowers, almost everything is endemic. So it means you can't find it anywhere else on the planet. So that makes it a very, very special place to go to. But very hard to get to because it's so isolated. But the most complicating factor was that Yemen has constantly been at war, mostly a civil war. That has made Yemen a very dangerous place to visit. That has been the main reason for me to not go there. There's still a civil war. It's actually one of the worst civil wars in recent history. It's extremely sad. It's especially sad that there's not so much media attention for this, because one of the biggest famines in the world is taking place there right now. It's very sad. But this has been a very complicating factor for me to go there, because for a long time no planes were flying there, even no boats wanted to go there. So I've tried, but I was never successful. And then suddenly 2 years ago, I heard that there was a flight going from Cairo in Egypt. And that's when I decided extremely quickly that, okay, it's now or never. I have to go there, because if I don't go now, then I might never go. So that's when I decided to go. And this was my main reason, these trees, because I absolutely love the shape of the trees. There is, by the way, on YouTube, if you Google for dragon blood, because that's the title of the video, you can find a mini documentary that I made with a filmmaker called Avi Rabelista. And together we made this little documentary about my trip to this amazing island. And this is my tent that I put here. I really like to use like extra elements as a focal point in images. We discussed earlier about my use of wildlife in landscapes or my use of people in landscapes, but this is basically the same thing. I mean, it's a tent. It's a tent, but it does exactly the same thing. It pulls your eye into the shot, and I deliberately did it like this. So this is the funny maybe is that this tent, the only reason I bought this tent is for the color. So there's if you have a choice of tents to buy, there you can choose from thousands of tents. And for me, it was pretty easy. I wanted to have an orange one. So that's the reason I chose this one. And then this image I already had in my mind during the day. I knew what I wanted to do. I know how this works. So I wanted to create a relatively dark foreground. I knew that there was going to be some moonlight during the night. And I knew I wanted to have the focal point not in the foreground, but in the background. So that the trees in the foreground would work as layers. So basically you have like these two layers in front of the third tree. And then by having everything dark, but having the main subjects inside the image, that creates a lot of depth. So the idea was to have the light shining through the tent and then to have the glow from the tent on the tree, illuminating the tree. So that's what you see here, except I did something else. It's not what you think I did, because the glow that you see inside the tent is actually not powerful enough to give that same glow on the tree. So what I did is I used the secondary light behind the tent, pointing directly at the tree. And I just used it at a very low output to make it feel like a glow. And I also used a gel on that light to mimic the sort of the color temperature of the light that's coming from the tent. So that's how this was done.
This is phenomenal. So this place still is kind of out of bounds, and because we hardly get to see images from here.
No, it's not. It's they stopped again. So it was a very brief, very small window where there was flights going, and I made use of that small window, and then very quickly, a couple of months later, they closed it off again.
But while
So,
there,
So while I was there, everything was fine. But the main challenge is that if you want to go here, you have to go through the mainland of Yemen, and that means that you have to land in Yemen. And there's a civil war going on, and obviously, an airport is a dangerous place to be when there's a war, because airports.
It is not a good time to go at all.
No.
No chance. Not because of
No.
the virus. Also, it's because there are a lot of problems going on.
Yeah.
Marsel,
So all right. Yeah, I was. For me, it was also a risk. And one of the risks is if you go to a country that is at war, there's no way to get a good travel insurance.
Yeah, even your embassy doesn't support properly, because
yes,
they already
exactly.
said you're not supposed to go there.
Yes, that's the two major problems. There's no embassy that supports you, and your travel insurance that you have will not be valid when something happens to you. That was the second problem. And the third problem is that when you're on an isolated island and something happens to you that requires a hospital, so medical attention, then you have to go to a hospital on that island, and that's not very good quality. So there's a big risk there involved as well. And then the fourth risk is when you're on such an island, very isolated, and then when something goes wrong, even worse on the mainland of Yemen, meaning that there's no flights anymore, then you're actually stuck on the island. So then you can't get back. So that's so those were 4 massive problems, potential big dangers. So I decided to do it anyway, and I'm very happy that I did it. But yeah, I was extremely careful, even with the hiking. Everything that I did, I was like twice as careful, because I constantly realized if I fall now and I break something, you know, I don't want to go to a hospital here.
Marcel,
So this-
a question on the composition
Yes.
for this image. What was the
I'll go
cutting
back.
off the top of the tree deliberate, and what was the thought process behind that?
Yeah, okay, it's a good question. Yes, so there's a couple of things happening in this image that are actually not very much like me. The main one being that the first and the second tree are touching each other.
Yes,
If you look at my work, then you'll see that this is very rare.
it is uncharacteristic.
I usually have no elements in my frame that are touching, especially not elements that are important. I'm always trying to find separation between the dominant shapes. And in this case, I also tried that. But you can already see that if I were to move more to the left, then the most important tree would also touch the biggest tree. So I really tried all kinds of angles, and then decided that I couldn't find a solution. So that's when I decided to make a compromise and actually have these 2 shapes merge. And now that I shot it, I can actually live with it, because it's more or less silhouetted. The main tree and the second tree, they sort of merge into one shape, so I don't mind it as much. Your other comment about the cropping at the top, that's actually very deliberate, because I'm very close to this tree. It's super large, and because of the wide angle, because I'm shooting this probably at between 14 and 20 millimeters, there's a lot of distortion, so the wide angle distortion, so that the top part of the tree is so close to me, and it's on top of me. So in order to have that entire tree in the frame, I could only do 2 things. Either I had to step away from it, but that would not give me a very nice perspective, or I would have needed to flip the camera to a vertical to include the entire top part of the tree. But then I found it the top half, well, not even half, like the top 4/5 of the image would be very dominant. And that's when I decided to crop it like this. And if I crop something, I usually crop it severely. There's not much I hate more than things that are barely cropped. So it's the same with an animal. You know, if you crop an animal, you make sure that it looks like a deliberate crop. So you don't cut off a little bit, you cut off a lot. So you cut off at least 1/3 of the animal, and then it will look like a deliberate decision. If it's less than that, people will think that you were too late. Yeah, that you didn't frame it properly.
Thank you. That's
Thank
a
you.
great thought process.
Yeah.
So that next image that you already saw a glimpse of, it's not very spectacular in terms of composition, but for me it just works because it's just, again, it's extremely graphic, it's simple, it's really to the point, and what it does, it really shows you how remarkable these trees are. All these lines. This is the best angle to fully appreciate how these trees work. They're very large, so you really can't tell usually in photographs. That's why the previous photograph is very useful, that with the tent, because it shows you the size of the tree. And I also like that it's so close to the edge of the cliff here. There's a very deep valley behind this tree. This is photographed in the early morning, so that's the backlight. I really like this kind of light where you're shooting into the light with the sun just outside of the frame. because it just brings everything to life. And tricky for the exposure. So usually I take several exposures. So this is also multiple exposures that I later merged into one. Right.
Okay.
Next one.
Yeah.
And it's not only for the trees that I went there, because as always, when I go to a certain area, I do a lot of research to figure out what my options are there. And one of the things I discovered very quickly was that the island also has an area that has pristine white sand, like really white, that I loved a lot. So I knew that I wanted to go there. And then, as always, usually I scout the place first to just figure out what are the best angles. And then usually the next day I go back there with a plan and then photograph all the angles very quickly with the best light. And this was one of the angles that I really liked. And again, if you photograph this without a person, it will look interesting. It will just look like an abstract. But those kind of images, like, well, they rarely ever work for me because I miss that sense of scale. So in a situation like this, I always like to use a person or something else. It could be like a tree or a rock or something interesting. And in this case, I asked my guide to walk around the dune that you see on the left side. So to walk all the way out of my frame on the left and then basically appear on that ridge while not creating any footsteps inside the frame. And then basically walk over that ridge from the left to the right towards that area where he is now. And that's when I took this photograph. I took many more photographs, but this is the one where I think he was in the best position, also with the best light and the best angle of his body.
Marsel, one quick question. In terms of your approach towards post-processing, I think it's a little light from what I assess. And you don't spend hours post-processing images from what I can see. The tones are natural, the light is natural, and that's the impact that I'm getting. Like, I feel that I'm part of this scale that you're exposing to us. Is this deliberate?
So yeah, in all my images, I usually try to keep the processing to look natural. So I try to, I don't like it when it looks like over-processed. I don't mind it if it looks a little bit processed, but I think that if you go too far, then suddenly people are paying more attention to the processing of the image than to the image itself. So that's why I prefer to keep it quite natural. There's a lot of things that I could have done with this image. I know that a lot of my colleagues would have probably made the shadows way more blue. Yeah. I think that's just what a lot of people do when they shoot scenes like this, like very blue or even purple shadows. For me, it's not something that I prefer to do because, like I said, if I see that, then I'm always like, that's not what it looks like when you see a scene like this in real life. You know, this is not this what you see now. What you're looking at now is more or less natural, what you would see with your own eyes, and those super blue shadows. That's something that your camera will see probably. So it will be natural for the camera, but not for the human eye. So it's one of the reasons why I prefer to keep it natural. It's the same, like I didn't select any images, maybe one that I photographed during the night. But if you look at night photography, you see a lot of images that show a Milky Way, and then the Milky Way is actually, the sky around the Milky Way is actually super blue, like almost like bright and vibrant blue. And it's become a very popular look on Instagram. And it's not something that I will probably ever do. because to me that just looks super strange, because there's not a single moment on Earth that a Milky Way sky would ever look like that. It's just impossible. It can't be done. The only way to get color in the night sky is if you have a full moon. But if you have a full moon, there is no Milky Way. So it's one or the other. Either you have a nice blue tone in the night sky with because of a full moon or a little bit of moonlight, or you have like a very, very detailed Milky Way. But if you have that, then you have a very dark sky with very little color in it. And so that's why I said for me, it just distracts from the image. If I see something happening in the image that I know for certain is the result of post-processing, and that to me, that's just a shame.
Good point.
Very interesting thought.
That's a very interesting thought.
Yeah. So here, this is a good image because it links into that. This is a night image, and you can tell because it's dark, and you can see the stars, but you can also see that it's blue, and you see exactly what I was talking about, because it's blue for a reason. The sky is blue because that light source that you see behind that baobab in the background is actually the full moon rising. So that's why there is color in the sky. And that's also why you see stars and not a Milky Way.
Yeah, there is a Milky Way on the top, right?
Yeah, it is a Milky Way, but it's very faint. It's only the most powerful stars from the Milky Way are visible.
Yeah.
All the faint ones you cannot see because there's too much light pollution from the moon. And so this is what I was explaining. It's one or the other. So if you're going to use moonlight because you want to use the light of the moon, it's very nice because it's very different from sunlight. If you look at the little baobab trees on the right hand side, even you see a little edge there, a light edge created by the moon. And if this were sunlight, it would be very warm. It would be very different. So this was something that I wanted to create, this look. This was shot during the project that I did for Nikon for the introduction campaign of the Nikon Z7. I visited 2 locations on Madagascar, and this was one of them with the baobab trees. I did a lot of scouting as usual. This was one of the shots that I wanted to photograph. So this was something that was in my head during the day. I wanted to photograph it at night with backlight. So we needed to time it correctly with the moon at the right angle at the right time, so that everyone was ready to take the shot when the moon would appear above the horizon. But that's not the most difficult part, because all those parts you can easily time and you can find out on the internet when is the perfect time to do that. The most important part in this image is actually that little person that you see dangling on the rope, that climber. This is why this image is an important image for me, because again, this is the result of pre-visualizing. And pre-visualizing for me is the most important thing, the most important creative tool that I use. And that means that I create the best images already in my head before I'm even at the location. Because this sort of image I had already thought of when I was still back in the Netherlands. And reason being that this location is actually similar to the one I showed you earlier in Namibia of Deadfly. This is a very iconic place in Madagascar. Tons and tons of photographs have been taken in this little area with these beautiful trees. So I started thinking, how can I create something that's unique, that has never been done before? And so that's how this all started. And so I decided to use a climber. I was actually not specifically for the trees, but for another location that I'll show you after this one. but I realized that if I use a climber, it will make so much more, it will make it so much different. And it worked because, again, it does all the things that I mentioned earlier. It adds a sense of adventure to the image. It adds a focal point. It adds depth, and it adds scale. And the most important thing for me, though, is that it is unique. There is not a single other image of this place in the world that looks like this. And it's the result of the thinking process that goes in front of the actual photography. And then, so the next image is this one. And that's shot during this, for the same campaign for the Nikon Z7. That was their first mirrorless camera. And when they approached me if I wanted to do this project for them, obviously I said yes, because they're just, well, they're a very prestigious brand, and they're a very, very nice brand to work for because they give you a lot of creative freedom. So then they told me that the only thing they wanted me to do is to show how sharp this new system actually was. Because the Z7 has a very, very large lens mount. And it means that the lenses that the engineers were able to design gave edge-to-edge sharpness. So basically their briefing was sharpness. And that's when I started thinking about how can I best demonstrate sharpness. And then I thought, well, the best way to do that would be to take this camera and these lenses to the sharpest landscape in the world. And I knew that this was one of the sharpest landscapes that I knew personally because I had been here before. And these are Tsingis. So this is it's like razor sharp, super, super sharp. You cannot walk or climb here without gloves because you would cut yourself. So that was my idea, to go here. And then the challenge was, how am I going to show the scale of this landscape? Because I knew that most people would have probably never have seen this before. So they would have a very hard time figuring out how big these mountains are. And that's when I decided, well, I have to get a person in there somehow. But there's no roads and there's no trails. So then I thought the only way to do this is actually to use someone who can climb there. And that was the start of the project. So I managed to find a climber who wanted to climb this for me. And so we hiked up here very, very early during the night in order to be here before sunrise. And that's when I shot this image. It's before sunrise because I wanted to photograph it without any direct light. And because I had this climber, I knew that I could also use him for the previous image with the trees. So this is why I like showing these two images, because they're an important demonstration of the creative thought process that is so important for me.
Yeah, this is, and just a very small question, that your creative thought process, do you think that you being in the creative field before getting into photography is helping you, or you always felt that you always had that and you could have still done it if it was not even for your stint in advertising?
Yeah, good question. Yes, absolutely. So my history in advertising and before that in graphic design is extremely important for the way that I work now. So the graphic design part is important because it's not a coincidence that I like graphic design so much. I'm just very much attracted to organizing shapes in a space. So because that's what graphic design is. You have a couple of elements and you need to arrange them in such a way that it looks very pleasing to the eye. And in a sense, that's the same as photography, because with photography also you have this frame And inside the frame, you have all these different elements that you need to organize in such a way that it makes sense, so that it looks logical, and also that it looks attractive. So it's very similar. And sort of my thought process is along those lines. And another thing that's has very much influenced me for the kind of work that I do now is actually that what I just talked about, the concept. So coming up with an idea first before you start shooting something. So in advertising, the first thing you do is you look at the message that you want to communicate, and then you sit down and you think very long and hard about what is the best way to communicate my message. And then you try to come up with very original ways, because if there's one thing that I've learned in advertising is that whatever you make, whatever you create in advertising, you're always creating something that people have not asked for. You know, that people don't want advertising. It's just there. So if you want people to look at your advertising longer than a microsecond, you better make sure that whatever you're creating, it is either super funny or super beautiful or super fun or super fascinating. And it has to be really special, because otherwise people will just like flip through the magazine super fast to get rid of the advertising until they find an interesting article again. And in many ways, I still think that way when I'm photographing, always thinking about, you know, what would surprise people, or what do people like to see. And I'm always photographing for me first, but obviously it's nice if people like what you're doing, especially when you're on an assignment. So these last two images from Madagascar were shot on an assignment. So then it's even more important that whatever I'm doing, it must be really good, because I first need to please the client, in this case Nikon, and also Nikon needs to be able to show their customers really spectacular images. So that brings along a lot of pressure, obviously, but also it forces you to think very long about how am I create something fascinating, something that's different, something that's not already out there, like because if you create something that looks very similar to what's already out there, people are not going to be very excited about it.
So Marsel, there are two aspects that were very, very fascinating for me. Apart from the fact that you are a Nikon shooter, this is for Nikon, I'm a Nikon shooter. I'll let that slide. But
we can see the glow on Sandeep's face.
So the one thing is that the color of this guy's shirt or T-shirt he's wearing, the eye straight away goes to that color. So is that color handpicked, or was it just something he was wearing that day?
So there's hardly ever anything in my images that's coincidental. So it's always planned.
Yeah.
So what you see here is also planned. So before we were here, I already knew obviously what the location was looking like. I knew that it was going to be very monochromatic, very gray-like, and I knew that I wanted to get a lot of attention on the climber. So when I arrived in Madagascar, actually, I went to the shop. There was a hotel shop. I went to the shop and started shopping for a new T-shirt for my model. Yeah, and I went for something like this. It's not the brightest red. It's also it's a little bit in between red and orange, and brown. Yeah, rust. Yeah. So that was more or less what I wanted to go for. Red is typically a very good color to use. It's the same reason I chose that orange tint. So orange, red, yellow, those tend to be colors that really stand out in the landscape.
Right. Thank you.
Shall I proceed?
Yeah.
proceed. Yeah, there's another example. Here the main subject is even smaller. This is a nice example to show that your main subject doesn't need to be big. It can be super tiny in the frame as long as there's enough separation. So in this case, the separation is created by color. Similar to the previous image, there's nothing coincidental in this shot. So what the guy is wearing is what I told him to wear, because I knew I wanted to have contrasting colors. So I asked him to wear this blue and white outfit. I actually asked him to bring a ton of different colors with him for the beginning of the trip, so that I could choose something different for every shoot. This also has to do about planning this image, because dunes are not very unique. There's a ton of places in the world where you can photograph sand dunes. You have them in every continent almost, except Antarctica probably. But other than that, there's dunes everywhere. The dunes here, this is in Libya. So already this is a special location, because not many people have ever been to Libya, especially now. But the dunes here are very tall, so very, very high sand dunes. This particular location I scouted a couple of days earlier, and instantly saw potential in these particular shapes. But then I realized that I wanted to go back here when the light was better, and especially when there was more wind, so that it would create all this sand blowing off the tops of the dunes. So that's what we did. We put up our camp very close to this location, and then when the light and weather conditions were perfect, we went back here. And that's when I asked my guide, because this person is actually my guide. I asked him to walk into the dunes, outside of the frame again, walk all the way behind that first ridge to the top of that first dune, and then start walking down from the top all the way, following that ridge line towards the camera. I took hundreds of photographs while he was walking down, and this is just one of them that I happen to really like, because again, this is another example of something that I planned very precisely, and something that I pre-visualized before I actually decided to photograph it.
Lovely.
Okay, next. Here's another one. So I'm just sticking with the theme for a couple of images. So this is on the other side of the spectrum. So we're going from super hot desert to super cold in Iceland. This is not so much planned, because I didn't really know what to expect when we were there. But this is interesting because one of the highlights of any trip to Iceland in winter is visiting an ice cave. So most people that visit Iceland want to be inside an ice cave, and I'm no different, because it's really something else. This was photographed in a year that Iceland was already getting overcrowded. So a lot of people were going to Iceland. It means also that a lot of people took photographs inside a couple of the most well-known ice caves. And that means that it is very hard to create something original again. And why I'm very pleased with this image is because it's unique. So there's not a second one. The reason being is that this is photographed inside an ice cave, but everybody walked past this little space, and it's because you cannot really see it in one shot. This is actually, it's a vertical panorama. So in order to see this as a single shot, you actually need to look upwards very much. So that's, so this is like, I don't know, 11 shots or something that I photographed from down to upwards. And it has also generated generated this rather dramatic curve in the ice. And that combined with the person in there, again, my guide, wearing red, nicely balanced by that sun star up the top. To me, this is a very well balanced image with that line from the lower right corner leading your eye all the way up into that. Well, it's almost like a portal, almost like a gate towards the gateway towards the sky. So lots of things in this image, I think, that work very nicely. But as always, with the images that are my personal favorites, is the most important thing is that I know that's unique. So there's not a second one like this. Can I continue?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Okay, cool. Yeah, so this is a same island. So same also in Iceland. And this I wanted to show because this is actually a place in Iceland that was not very popular because it's very small. It was nothing more than just these two very short tunnels. People they prefer to go to the big and spectacular ice caves. But yet I like this very much. And it just goes to show that something doesn't need to be very large or super spectacular. You can also create something very interesting, even when it's more subtle. And this now looks very dramatic. It's just because I shot it with a 14mm, and that's actually Daniela standing there at the end of the second tunnel, just again to draw your eye and give a focal point. And it's the third one of that series is one that I never shared before. Oh. I only recently processed it. And it's actually another example of an image that you will not find anywhere else.
Yeah.
For the same reason, this is actually very small. So the area where I'm standing to my left and to my right, it doesn't look very spectacular. I have this huge piece of ice very close to the camera. So that's the darker piece that you see on the right-hand side. And then there's a large ice sheet in the background that was only interesting to me because of that opening. And again, I knew that if I could have someone pose there for me, it would create a very powerful focal point, and it would create a lot of depth with that piece of ice in the foreground. So that's how this was created. And again, not a super spectacular location, but it's always a good idea to also try to look at the location in small elements. So try to ignore the bigger parts and try to isolate smaller parts and see if you can work with that.
I think it's also probably, I don't know, since you decided to go to these smaller ice caves, so you might not even have gotten too much tourists there.
No, actually, when I shot this one and the previous one, there were no tourists.
Yeah,
so I was there.
Advantage.
Yeah. So I was only there with Daniela, and so we had the place to ourselves, and we could just walk around, take our time, and that's very nice to do. But the consequence as well is that you have to work with locations that may not be like the top locations. But that's why I like to show these last two images. Even though they're not the top locations, you can still take very high quality images there, with the added benefit that whatever you do, it will be more unique than the iconic places.
Right.
No. All right. So now I think we're going to. Oh no, still. This is another image that I've never shared before. This is a different kind of unique. So there's unique in a sense that you isolate something or you see something different than other people see that have been standing in the same location. this is a different kind of unique because it's unique in a sense that no one has ever seen this before. And that's because it's in an extremely remote area in Libya. So already not many people go to Libya. And then the people that go to Libya only go to the same spots. So we used 2 4-wheel drive vehicles and we drove very, very deep into the Sahara, basically without a plan. The only plan was to find spectacular locations. So we were just driving all over the place, deeper and deeper into unknown territory, and just in full discovery mode. And that's when you find spots like this. And this was just amazing because it's such a unique shape and balancing on such a small part at the base. And it comes to no surprise that I decided to ask my guide again to stand there during sunset. This time in a fully white outfit because I just thought it would look nicest. And then just before the sun disappeared, I photographed this. And again, I think without that tiny little person, this image would mean nothing to me.
Absolutely.
It would just be nice to look at. It would just be interesting. I would appreciate the colors and the light, but it would not capture me at all. And now it instantly grabs me. This is immediately, it gives me so much scale, and I'm like, oh my God, wow, that's a very special location. So a different
Also,
kind of unique.
it gives you a feel of some kind of a post-apocalyptic world.
Well, we seem to be living in one, so it's very appropriate. So that's a nice way to switch to wildlife. So this is one of my most popular images, I guess, that I've ever shot. It's from my very first year as a professional photographer, so many years ago. It's also this is also the vertical version of one of my first publications in National Geographic magazine. Obviously, I'm very pleased with this. Again, same reason. This is unique. Nobody else has this image, but it's different in a sense that I could never have planned for this. With wildlife, there's always the luck factor.
Right.
You have to be lucky. You can never predict what will happen exactly, which is both very frustrating and also it's what makes it so interesting, I think. Frustrating in a sense that when the light is perfect and the conditions are perfect and the animal is there, usually the animal is not perfect. It's facing the wrong direction or it's not doing what you want. And when the animal is perfect, usually the conditions are crap. So there's always that perfection that wildlife photographers are aiming for, and they hardly ever get. This is one of those rare moments where everything sort of seemed to fall to come together. I was photographing here for the book that I mentioned earlier. We were photographing for one of the lodges close to this location. And the funny thing is that when we visited Victoria Falls, my initial instinct was, I'm not even going to bother to bring a camera because this place has been photographed to death. What am I going to do here that has not already been done a gazillion times before? And I brought my camera anyway, and that's when we heard from the locals that there was an elephant actually roaming the area. People had seen it getting closer to the shore, not the shore, what is the cliff.
Yeah.
And that's when we decided to spend some more time there. This is when the elephants dare to go into the water, and this is what they're after. Those fresh green bits. They can only go there when the water level is low, because when the water level is too high, it's too dangerous for them, because they would actually just they would go over the edge, which happens every now and then. So they have to wait for the water level to drop, and then they can swim from place to place to place until they reach this part, which still has fresh green vegetation, even though in the surroundings everything is almost dead, because this is at the end of the dry season. So this is why these elephants, they really want to go to these places, because it's the only place that still has fresh greens. And I was standing very close to the edge of another part of Victoria Falls to photograph this. I have a vertical and a horizontal. The horizontal was used in National Geographic magazine. I actually prefer the vertical more because you see more of the falls, and the elephant is smaller in the frame as a result, and it looks even more spectacular, I think. So there's another shot that also shows this. Wow. So this is a very common bird. It's if you've ever been to Africa, then you've seen this bird many times.
Yeah.
The oxpecker.
Yeah.
And for me, this is an interesting shot because I don't actually like photographing birds very much. So I don't have a lot of bird images on my website also. The reason is not that I don't like birds, because I do. I appreciate birds. I think a lot of them are very beautiful and actually way more colorful than mammals. So you have to appreciate birds, but as a photography subject, I don't like them very much, and it has a lot to do with the way that I like my photographs to look like. So all the images that I've showed you so far, you've noticed that the habitat is super important. What I do, the landscape is often more important than the subject. And so I like to do the same thing with birds. The problem with birds is though that they're very small. Most of the birds are tiny. And if you want to show the habitat, it means you have to zoom out. And when you do that, the bird gets so small that you can't even recognize the bird anymore. So this is one of the reasons why most of my bird images show big birds. The bigger the bird, the less I have to zoom in. So the shorter the focal length can be, and the shorter the focal length, the more habitat I can show. So this is the reason for me to focus on big birds and not on small birds. This is one of the few exceptions, because this is actually a very small bird. But most of the time it's also small in the frame. And here I was lucky enough to be relatively close to this buffalo. I was able to use a 600 millimeter and frame it like this. Again, this is a situation where for me everything fell together. The light was good. This buffalo had just been taking a mud bath. So it's very gray. I like that it has closed its eye so that there's no distraction from an eye, because if it had opened its eye, it would have drawn a lot of attention, because our own eyes are always drawn to other eyes. Yeah. So if there's a massive eye in an image, that's immediately where your eye will want to go. So that's why I picked this image where the eye was actually closed. And then the rest of the image is so monochromatic that really makes the bird stand out very much. So this, for me, is just a beautiful shot, because the perch where the bird is standing, to me, everything makes sense. And this is exactly what I'm after in my photography. So the next shot also has a bird, I think. No, not a bird. So this is what I like to do most. So wow. Elephants are probably the largest mammal that I can imagine to photograph, apart maybe from, what is it, the blue whale or something. So massive animals, and the advantage of shooting very large mammals is that you can zoom out very much. And this is what this is just something that's typical of my style. So this is what I like to do most. you can photograph elephants in many, many places in the world. They're in India, they're all over the place in Africa, they're in other places in Asia. So if you're an elephant lover, you could say, well, there's so many places, I'll just pick one and try to get nice elephant shots. For me, it always works very different. Most of the time it works the opposite way. I'm different from most of my colleagues. So the habitat for me, most of the time, is more important than the subject. So when I want to photograph elephants, my first instinct is to think about what does the habitat look like? What kind of habitat do I want? And that's the reason why I started photographing elephants in Zambia, because of all the places in the world where you can photograph elephants. For me, Zambia is the nicest place because of this, because it has these trees. And these trees are huge, and the trees, they dwarf even an elephant. They are very graphic, especially if you go there at the right time of year with the right light conditions. And this is the kind of composition that I'm always looking for. You can clearly see that this is very graphic. You have very strong backlit lines, and the framing, I think, is perfect. The position of the elephant could not be better. So this is just something that I really enjoy. If I shoot something like this, I'm just very excited, even though the elephant is only small in the frame. I've never shared this before, so you have this is the first time I've ever showed this.
That's fantastic, Marsel. Now, so if I decipher what you just said, is that you just don't decide you don't just choose a place for its wildlife or for its landscape, but you choose a place where you can create unique compositions, let's say wildlife, so with an interesting habitat. That is what your probably research would do in terms of places and spots that you want to go. And same is with your landscapes, because when we saw your landscapes as well, so you were very, very clear that you wanted to go to the smaller kind of the ice caves, and everything is so meticulously planned. And it is not just the elephant, it is not just these trees, it is not just, but everything has to fall in place.
Yeah, so it's no coincidence that I like to do wildlife and landscape photography. And when I do my wildlife photography, the way that I approach my wildlife photography is basically as a landscape photographer. So I'm very much focused on the landscape. So this is the main reason I prefer to photograph elephants here and not in the Masai Mara, for instance.
So what would be the focal length here?
India, you said?
What would be the focal length here?
Oh, the focal length, sorry. This is probably shot with, I can zoom out and then I can look at my metadata maybe. Oh no, I can only see you, I can't see my metadata.
No, it's okay. Just
I think it was approximately, oh, maybe if I press I, then it will show up. No, that doesn't work. I think it was approximately.
Yeah, it came for a second.
I think it was with a 70 to 200
which is
millimeter, probably.
Yeah.
I think it showed 80 mm. Press I.
It's not super short, so it's not with a wide angle lens. I was a fair bit of. No, I think a 70 to 200.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I'm sorry, but it was not. It was not like
It's there.
300. It was not 300 plus.
There it is.
230 mm.
You can also already tell, because if you look at the background behind the elephant, you see that there's quite a lot of detail there.
Yeah.
So I would never have been able to get something like that. With,
all right. Perfect.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So that's that, and then the next one. Yeah, this another example.
Wow.
This is an older image. So this birds again.
One of my
But-
favorites.
But you see, my approach to shooting birds is I'm very different from the average bird photographer, because the average bird photographer is obsessed with detail. The average bird photographer would like to have the bird very close to the camera, or very like almost frame filling, with a ton of sharpness, so that you're able to count every single little feather. For me, that's not important. So I just like to show the animal in its habitat. And this, I just knew that I wanted to have something like this. So I got up super early, and I arrived here. This is in Japan. I arrived here very early before sunrise. The swans were still sleeping, and I was moving super quietly as to make not any sounds and not to wake them. And then I used 14 millimeter. I know that this was shot at 14 millimeter because I wanted to use the distortion of the perspective, all those lines from the branches that were actually right above me, and they were all like showing, well, pointing towards the subjects.
Yeah. It's wonderful.
Yeah, so it's not it's a simple image, but it's this is a perfect example of I think what my photographic style
Yeah.
is all about. I have more
think
examples.
One
There's
of
another-
my favorites from you as well.
Thank you. This is a very recent one. I shot this on one of our last tours in Botswana. You could argue what is the main subject here. It's obviously the giraffe is very large, but I really enjoy having the birds in here. These are also oxpeckers, so just as the other one. They're very small in this image, but I would argue that even though they're small, they're super important here. They just bring this whole shot to life, especially that one that's flying in front of the sun. Difficult subjects to photograph, giraffes. That's probably one of the, well, I think the Masai Mara is probably the nicest place to photograph them, because you can photograph them all the way. There's no distractions around them. In most other places, it's very difficult because of what you see happening here also. A lot of vegetation, lots of branches, bushes and stuff. But shooting it like this, like backlit, it more or less makes this giraffe merge with the background, so that you don't see the distractions very much. We did this early morning. This was actually a plan. So I brought my group. We drove to an open area, just looking for if we could find giraffes, and then trying to do something like this. And so I'm very happy that we succeeded with that.
I like the red glow on the neck.
Yeah, that's always very nice. Yeah, those backlit, the rim light. Yeah, that's super cool. Doesn't work with all animals. So with an elephant, you don't get that. But any animal that has fur or feathers, you usually get this. Yeah, that's very cool to do. And you have to be careful that you really underexpose your image sufficiently to actually show that color. Because if you shoot this in aperture priority or something, it's very likely that sun is going to be super bright, and that those rim lights are actually going to be white instead of red.
Thank you.
And so the next image is a similar thought process. So there's a penguin in there. This was photographed in Antarctica. It's very easy to photograph penguins because there's a lot of them there. That's one reason, and the other reason is they're totally relaxed, so they're not afraid of human beings. But for me, again, I was very drawn to this particular penguin, not because I was so in love with this penguin, but because I was in love with the landscape.
The composition. the landscape.
Yeah, the composition. I like this line
Love it.
cutting through the frame. I really like this whole structure of the rocks. I like the contrast between having this high texture, warm tones in the rocks, contrasting with the cool tones and the low texture in the rest of the image. I also like the way how the rocks give scale to the penguin and vice versa. So this is just an image that shows the landscape of Antarctica, and it has, as a bonus, it has the penguin.
And
Instead of photographing a penguin, just frame filling penguin shot. I can appreciate a frame filling penguin shot, but it doesn't excite me as much as something like this. Right, so next shot is, it's another bird, but clearly the bird here is not in focus. So that tells us immediately that the bird is not the main subject. So clearly the bear is the main subject. And this is just a coincidence. So I was not planning this beforehand. I was focusing on this little bear. It's a bear cub. It was moments before this happened, the bear cub was actually rubbing this little tree. And then there was this gull flying overhead, and it circled overhead. And then the bear cub was suddenly standing up on his hind legs and looking upwards. And that's when I flipped to a vertical to be able to include the bird into the shot. So to be able to show what the bear cub was actually looking at. So again, I really enjoy this shot because it goes one step further than just showing the main subject. It shows something else. It shows an interesting animal doing something interesting. So there's a very nice, how do you call that? Not a habitat shot, but well, action shot. And yeah. I don't mind the bird being out of focus because I'm shooting this with a lot of millimeters, probably 600. So chances that that bird is flying at exactly the same distance as my focal point are 1,000,000 to 1. So I knew that it was going to be out of focus, but I think for the story, it doesn't matter at all. The only thing that I need is to show what the bear cub is actually looking at. So,
Marsel, there is a question that's cropping in my head that most people would say that, and you also mentioned that in wildlife it's more of a matter of luck.
Yes.
And you mentioned that when you showed the first image of that elephant at the edge of the waterfall.
Yes.
And so my question is that how do you really think that most people are just plain lucky to get these kinds of shots, including you, or it is the power of observation that you are quickly are in a position to observe, which most people would miss?
I think it's a combination of those and several other factors. I mean, obviously, luck is super important because as a wildlife photographer, there's just so many factors that you have to deal with. And the main one being your subject. I mean, I always say when people ask me what is more difficult, wildlife or landscape, that's a hard question to answer because they're both difficult in their own ways. So for me, wildlife photography is easy in a sense that you immediately know where to point your lens. Yeah. This is what makes wildlife photography easy. You know where your subject is.
Yeah.
You know where to point your lens.
Yeah.
This is what makes landscape photography difficult. You walk into a landscape, it's not immediately clear where you have to point your lens.
Yeah.
You know, it's that you have to make that most important creative decision. Also happens to be the most difficult one in terms of landscape photography. However, in terms of the technique and how fast you need to think, wildlife photography is so much more difficult than landscape photography because with wildlife photography, everything is fleeting. And even though a sunrise or a sunset is also a fleeting moment, you can plan for that. You know exactly how long it's going to take. But with wildlife, you always have to be prepared. You always have to expect the unexpected.
Yeah.
When something happens, you have to think super fast, because you have to think, oh, what am I going to do? Am I going to shoot it as a vertical or a horizontal? Do I keep my settings almost at like landscape settings, because then I can shoot at a low ISO, gambling that the animal will not suddenly start to run? But what if the animal suddenly starts to run? You know, what kind of settings do I need to switch to? Because you need to be super fast, because if you don't do that, all your shots are going to be blurred. Where is the animal going to move into? You have in your head, you have to come up with so many alternative scenarios while you are shooting, and you have to constantly look over your camera. You cannot risk looking only through your lens, because if you do that, you're not going to be prepared for something that's going to walk into the frame from outside your field of view. So in that sense, wildlife photography is much more difficult than landscape. If you miss an opportunity with landscape, there's not a big deal. You know, you can just return the next day, try again.
Not going to fly.
You can just keep trying, because that landscape is not going to run away. Yeah. That landscape is still going to be there, and it's going to look exactly the same. Maybe it's going to look a little bit more green, or maybe there's going to be snow. But again, you can plan for it, and you can return to exactly the same location, and you can probably get exactly the same shot. With wildlife photography, that's absolutely not the case. Most of the photographs that you will take as a wildlife photographer, you will never be able to replicate it, because they're one-off moments.
Yeah, I think you've answered it so well. Now you are you, just one small question, that are you a handheld kind of a shooter, or you prefer tripod with gimbal head, or a monopod with gimbal head, something like that?
I'm in love with my tripod, so whenever I can shoot with the tripod, I will always use it. I will always use the tripod. But when I can't, then I prefer to shoot handheld, especially on the safaris. On the safaris, you're usually in a vehicle, and when you're in a vehicle, when you're shooting wildlife, you have to be able to respond super quickly. Yeah. So when your camera is fixed on either a bracket or on a tripod, it's almost impossible to respond very quickly, because you might be pointing your camera to the left of your safari vehicle, and then something much more spectacular suddenly happens on the other side of the vehicle. You'll be too late when your camera is mounted to something. So on all my safaris, I'm shooting off beanbags.
Yeah, beanbags.
Even this image. So this is another bird. It's a very big bird. It's actually the biggest heron there is. So this is the Goliath heron that I photographed in South Africa. And again, it's no coincidence that I photograph a big bird, because it's big, I can zoom out and I can show a lot of the habitat. This I just really liked, because there was only light on the heron, and the background was still in the shade. So that really makes the subject stand out. And if
Marsel,
yes,
in continuation to what you were telling us a while back, has it ever happened like your luck has run out while trying to create some image, and you haven't been able to capture it yet, and you are still planning to do it? Has it so happened?
Yeah, there's always, like, if you ask wildlife photographers if they have a list of shots that they want to get than they always have. And most of the photographers, that list will be the same for a long time, because the reason they have that list is because those shots are typically difficult to get. And you just need to be lucky, because again, everything has to fall into place. So to give you an example, to photograph penguins on a blue iceberg is something every photographer always wants, because it just looks super pretty. But blue icebergs are not very common in the Antarctic waters. And to find penguins on icebergs is also a small percentage. So to find penguins on a blue iceberg is just a small percentage of a small percentage. So that makes it hard. So I also have a long list of animal shots that I would like to get and still don't have, because it simply hasn't happened yet. No. This is another bird shot, but it's I think a nice example of how I'm trying to create something that looks different than just a bird. So this is a very large bird, a pelican, photographed it on our Namibia tour, photographed from a boat. Because the subject is large, I can shoot with a shorter focal length. So this was photographed with 24 millimeters. This pelican actually flew next to our boat, very close. And I knew that the background was boring, as you can see. It was a little bit misty. So because of the mist, you can't really see the background very much. There's also no color anywhere. And that's when I decided to try something different with motion blur like this. It's not easy to do because you never know what you're going to get. So it takes a little bit of experience and also a lot of luck. And what I wanted to get here is what you're seeing now. Most of the time we had like 1 or 2 pelicans flying very close together. And I wanted to have a part of one pelican in the foreground and then another pelican in the background, so that you have more depth. I managed to get it a few times, and this is the one that I liked most. If I'm honest, if you're shooting this, I probably throw away 98% of the images that I shoot. So if I take 1,000 images, that's like close to 1,000 that I actually throw away most of the time, because there's always something that's not right. So I'm shooting this at a 30th of a second, I think. So that's very slow for photographing something that is moving. So you have to move the camera in continuous autofocus with the autofocus sensor precisely on the head. You have to pan the camera with the subject at exactly the same speed. If you go faster than the subject, you'll get blur. If you go slower than the subject, you'll get blur. If you don't pan only in the horizontal axis, but also move a little bit in the vertical axis, you'll cause blur. And so there's so many things that can go wrong and usually go wrong. And this is just one of the very rare cases where the head is like tack sharp, and the amount of motion blur in the wings, for me, is just perfect, because I can see all the wing tips, but they have just the right kind of blur to them. It's almost like paint or something, especially the top part. It's very pleasing to the eye. Also having the wings at the same position. So both of the wings of the birds are pointing downwards. So yeah, there's so many things that can go wrong, and usually they do.
They do.
So again, there you have that luck factor again. And most wildlife photographers will tell you that that's actually what keeps them going, because it's a bit like going to the casino. You know, when you go to the casino, you know that your chances are very slim, but you also know that you actually have a chance that you might win. And that makes people want to go back. And it's the same with wildlife photographers. We know that every now and then you actually get lucky. And we are actually more in control of what we do compared to people who go to the casino, obviously. And it also means that people that are wildlife photographers, a lot of them tend to be even more control freaks than landscape photographers, because we are constantly dealing with this huge
Unpredictability.
unknown. Yeah, this huge unknown factor, which also happens to be our main subject.
Yeah.
So the fact that we have no control over our main subject means that we tend to try to control everything else. So we try to control the weather conditions, the location, everything. So we're usually very well prepared. Yeah. All right, let me go to the next one. This is another example of a bird, even bigger. This is the biggest bird I've shown so far. This is not a spectacular habitat, but it is a habitat. And this is actually the reason to go to this location at this particular time of the year, because that's the only time of the year that you actually have this kind of surroundings. So I photographed these animals a lot of times, these birds. I've been there many, many years, always wanting to get something like this. Again, it happens, but it rarely happens when everything comes together. So here, everything is perfect because the way they're positioned is perfect. But more importantly, the light is perfect. There's no sunlight, which is always something that I'm hoping for when I'm here, because it would create a lot of high contrast, blown out highlights, too much detail in the snow. And also the background is perfect here. There's not another bird in the background, which usually happens. Most of the times there's other cranes. So yeah, this is one of my best crane shots, because it's so clean, it's so graphic, it's so minimalist, and it's almost a mirror image of two birds this is actually part of their mating ritual, their dancing ritual that they do when they greet each other.
It's like a symphony.
It is, yes.
Yeah, this and in fact, I was about to speak about this image, and also the image of the gazelles from Namibia, where everything is coordinated and everything is in it's symphonic. It seems like all these animals listens to you, and like they pose for you, like you say, okay, do this, and they do it. Do it for you.
If only it worked like that.
So on a lighter note, I think these animals would also know that, oh, Marsel has come, so he will click the best of us.
I think in my dreams it happens exactly like that. I probably need to speed up a little bit because I still have some to show you. This is one of my most well-known images, because it won such a big award, golden snub-nosed monkeys. It's a nice link to that one image where one of you asked about my composition where the two trees were touching. And then I mentioned that usually in my images, the main shapes are not touching. And that's actually one of the reasons why initially I didn't want to enter this image into the Wildlife Photographer of the Year, because you can clearly see that these two monkeys are touching, and it has always bothered me. I would have preferred them to be separated. So the first time actually this didn't want to enter them. It's only the second year that I decided, okay, what the hell, I'll just enter it. So it's just interesting to see how that works, because clearly what I've learned from that is that I'm more critical than I should be.
Then should be.
Maybe. Anyway, so this is the most famous one. I have another one that also won an award in the European Wildlife Photographer of the Year. same subject, but then there's a large male on the right-hand side, and there's a juvenile on the left. So it's the same species, but when they're born, they have this light color. And again, here for me, the way that I'm photographing this is like a landscape photographer. Yeah. So I'm not too much focused on the animal itself. I'm constantly looking at the habitat. This is my main focus. So when I'm following these animals through the forest, all I'm doing is looking at the habitat. I'm constantly looking at the background. So with the previous image also, it was these rocks that are just beautiful. It was the light coming in from that corner in the background that made me want to photograph this very much. And similarly in this image, it was that log, that diagonal that's pointing into the frame, leading your eye all the way to this juvenile monkey, and all that beautiful moss. That's just the main reason to photograph this. I actually got a lot more. So this is a lesser known, but it's the same species. In all these images, I've created my own light. So in all the shots you see, there's no natural light. This is all flashlight. And the reason for me to do that is to control the backgrounds. So if you look at the other shots, you'll see that the backgrounds are extremely cluttered. Yeah. Just a lot going on. This is exactly the opposite of what I like in my images. So for me, the reason to solve that problem was to bring my own light and create my own light, thereby using a polarizer to eliminate reflections in the background, and then underexposing the whole scene, and then using my flashlight as the main light source. So this is what you see here even more. So very much underexposed image, where I use the flashlight from an angle to almost create backlight. You see the rim light on the monkeys, and I really like working like that.
Marsel, just a quick.
So these are off-camera flashes. Sorry, Som. Sorry, I interrupted you. So these are off-camera flashes.
Yeah, absolutely off camera. Yeah, I don't use
on-camera. The animals don't mind the flash.
No, from my experience, there's not a single animal that minds flash. My rule of thumb is very easy. If the animal minds the flash, you'll notice immediately. You'll see it. If they mind it, they will either move away, run away, fly away, or look the other direction, etc. It's not so different from humans. You know, if somebody takes your photograph and it has a flash, you know, it's usually not bothering anyone. It's the same with animals. You have to realize that a flash like this, it's very, very short flash duration, and the output is not very high. So even though there's flashlight, it's very soft, it's very subtle. So these animals, they see that something is happening, but it's not going to bother them more than, let's say, when lightning strikes, which is 100,000 times more bright.
Yeah, I was about to say that.
The only time you have to worry about flashlight is when you see that the animal minds the flashlight, then you should stop using the flash. Or when you're photographing at night. At night, a flash can temporarily blind an animal, and that's not going to be a good idea, especially not if that animal is a prey animal, because then you give the predator an advantage, because then the prey animal cannot see the predator coming. So that would be one of the reasons. So be a little bit more hesitant using it at night, but during the daylight, I don't think there's any reason to not use flashlight on wildlife during daylight, even though you'll find wildlife photographers who say that it's not good. In those cases, you should ask those photographers to direct you to these scientific evidence that proves that in fact animals are bothered by flashlight, because it doesn't exist. There is no evidence whatsoever that even remotely suggests that wildlife is bothered by flashlight.
Right.
So how far
There's another,
and also
from here, Marsel, last question on this, how far were the flashes from the animals?
it depends per image. And for these animals, these are actually very approachable. So I was not very far away from them. Almost everything that I've shown you so far was either shot with a 24 to 70 or a 70 to 200. This is a 70 to 200. And the flash is probably maybe maximum 10 meters away from the animal.
Okay.
So not very far. You also don't want it to be intrusive. So even though the animals might not be bothered by the flashlight, they might actually want to look at where the flash is coming from, which is also not something that you want. So in these cases, Daniela is holding the flash for me. So she's my mobile light stand. So I'm just talking to her, and I'm just asking her to move a little bit closer, or a little bit towards me, or a little bit away from the camera to get the best angle for the light. This is not always possible, clearly.
Yeah.
This is only possible when you use flash on animals that are comfortable and that are comfortable with your presence. This the animal I very much like. Here's another one I've never shared before. So it's also an animal where I used flash, but off-camera flash, but through like a little snoot. So to focus the flashlight into a very small area, so that the flashlight is only hitting a small area in the frame. Yeah, very nice effect, I think. It only shows the elements that are important. So you see there's a subtle glow on the tree, on those roots. That I think the roots are very important. And then, yeah, the mother with the child, very nice effect. And this is one of my most recent ones from this species. This is one of those shots that I had on my list, but was extremely difficult to get because, again, you have to be super lucky that everything falls into place. This is just a river or a stream, I should say, that runs through this landscape. Always wanted something like this to happen, and when I saw these monkeys moving towards this location, that's when I immediately knew what I wanted to do. So already before this monkey actually reached this spot, I had already changed to my my Z7 with a 24-70 lens on it. I used my tripod. I had set my tripod down. I framed this composition even without the monkey in here. And then as the monkey was walking towards the frame, I was fine-tuning my composition. I added the polarizer to be able to influence the reflections in the background and of the surface of the water. Then I waited for the monkey to walk into the frame. I shot all those frames with a fairly fast shutter speed to be able to get everything in focus. And then when I was happy with what I got, I waited. I didn't touch the camera. I waited for the monkey to leave the frame. And when the frame was empty, I changed my settings to I think half a second and lowered the ISO very much while keeping everything the same. And I took a second shot, and that second shot I used for the water, because otherwise I would never be able to take a shot like this, because to get this amount of blur in the water, you need to shoot at approximately half a second. But if you shoot this at half a second, your subject is not going to be in focus. It's going to be blurred. So this is why I decided to shoot the subject first and then change my settings to landscape settings after it had left the frame. And this is a fine example of, again, how I photograph wildlife. It's thinking like a landscape photographer. So it's very much planning ahead and focusing my attention primarily on the landscape, running the risk that this monkey would actually not even show up inside the frame. But that's just part of the fun and of the, yeah, what I like to do.
Marsel, are you on foot while all these images or what?
Yeah, I'm on foot. Yeah, I could basically just follow the monkeys from a distance. Yeah, I'm probably, I don't know, 15 meters away, 20 meters away from them. But even if I were to move closer, I could. So they're quite relaxed, especially if you don't like start running or something. If you move slowly and you don't start waving your tripod around, then they're pretty relaxed. As with most other monkeys and primates, they get used to human presence very quickly. Yeah, so they tend to be one of the least skittish animals to photograph. Yeah.
Nice.
That, yeah, so this is very similar to that crane shot that I showed you earlier. Also symmetrical, perfect conditions, white on white, and for just the perfect kind of action. Yeah, it's hard not to get excited when you shoot something like this, and it fits my photographic style very much. Leopards, I have so many thousands of leopard shots, but it's very hard to get something like this. Yeah. Most of the time, the leopard is in a tree, and it's going to be behind a branch or behind a leaf. There's almost so many distractions. This is pure luck, obviously. You just need to be at the right time, in the right spot, and then frame it like this. I have very little influence on something like this, but it's what I like to do most. Cool. This is a tiger. It's not photographed in Asia, but in Africa. You may have heard from this project. It's a so-called ex situ conservation project. So that means it's a conservation project outside of the normal habitat where you usually find a certain species, in this case, a tiger. When this project started in 2000, poaching was really bad for tigers. India was really struggling to battle the poaching. So the number of tigers was dropping extremely fast. So it looked very grim. And that's when John Varty came up with the idea to try to raise tigers outside of the Indian continent, so in this case in South Africa, and to get a population of self-sustaining tigers in a separate continent. Just in case, so that if the tigers in India would face extinction, there would be other tigers living in the wild, but in a different area. So this is not a new concept because it's been tried with many species before. This is just the most controversial one because it's tigers. And obviously tigers is a sensitive subject, especially for people that live in tiger countries. I've always embraced this project because I tend to embrace projects that are out of the box. And I thought, well, it makes sense. If you run the risk of losing a species, then it's better to save that species elsewhere and end up with maybe 2 places where the species lives in the wild, than running the risk that they completely disappear. Anyway, so this is a very successful project now in South Africa. It's been growing for 20 years. It's a very large project now. That's these tigers are roaming free in the wild, have a huge area. They hunt, they kill, they mate, they do everything that tigers in India do, but obviously different. The habitat is different, although it has everything that they like. So it has a ton of water. It has very tall reeds for them to hunt in. But this kind of typical grass you won't find in India. So if the people that photographed a lot of tigers instantly know, hey, this is different. It's also something that I like because clearly this image is different from all those other images. I also like the contrast between the tiger and the habitat, just the low contrast, the softness, the low color. So that's one of my favorite tiger images.
Yeah, this is very unique actually.
Yeah. Here's another one. It's a little bit similar as the monkey that I showed you with the water.
Yeah.
This is a very old one. The same sort of thinking. There was lots of bears fishing for salmon here. So there was lots of action. But instead of trying to focus on the one bear catching the perfect salmon, you know, everything razor sharp, I was the one photographer focusing on the sleeping bear, the only bear that wasn't doing anything spectacular, just because I wanted to get something like this. I knew that this was going to give me something much more unique than bear catching a salmon. And so again, I've many polar bear shots. This is one of my favorite polar bear shots. Just because of the blood, I think the blood is just super nice in combination with the innocent fluffiness of the polar bear cub. It's just that contrast between cuteness and innocentness with like the brutal, the blood fest that must have gone before this. You know exactly what has happened.
Yeah.
And so that's what I like very much. Also, I like the surroundings very much. So the background, it's like low contrast, everything white, a little bit of a blue tint in the ice in the foreground. And so that tells us that it's more compressed, so a little bit older ice. So yeah, nice cool tones. Just a simple but very effective image. This is also an image I've never shared before in full color. I've shared it before in black and white, but this is the first time I'm sharing it in color. Again, this is mostly about the surroundings. I have so many photographs of leopards in similar poses, but it's very rare to get a background like this with the beautiful soft sunlight through the canopy and a very interesting log that it's sitting on. It's just the overall light and colors I think are very pleasing, which makes this one of my favorite leopard shots. Something similar here. This is also from Madagascar again, and similar situation where it's just a frame filling shot of an animal. So from an artistic point of view, it's actually not that special, but there's a couple of things here that make it work very nicely. It's nicely backlit. The angle of the lights is very nice. The pose of the animal is super nice. It's very dynamic with the diagonal line of the branch, the diagonal line of the arms. There's good eye contact. So that I think works very nice here. And then I'm going to rush a little bit towards the end so that people don't fall asleep. This is one of my most popular images, also one of my most stolen images. This image has been stolen to death.
Whose phone was this?
I don't know the person whose phone it is. I only know that it was the phone from a Chinese tourist lady who was standing next to me. And while I was photographing with my 70-200, she was photographing with her iPhone. This monkey happened to be very close to us. Again, monkeys tend to be not very afraid of people. So this one was very close to us. I was not actually photographing it because it was too close, but my neighbor was photographing with this iPhone. I was trying to take close-ups of this monkey, and she was constantly pushing her iPhone closer and closer to the monkey, up to the moment where the monkey probably thought that this was a gift. So it grabbed the phone from this lady and retreated back into the hot springs, and then started playing with the phone. That was hilarious. I was laughing very hard because I was happy that this happened, because this particular tourist was not keeping enough distance from the monkey, was not being respectful of this monkey's personal space. So I thought it was a lesson well learned. Yeah. And then I was very focused immediately. Again, this is where the brain of a wildlife photographer goes super fast, because immediately I realized this is a shot. I need to get this. So I was immediately trying to get into a different position where my background would be less distracting. So I very quickly moved to a different angle, and I changed my settings, and I was constantly trying to get both a good view of the head of the monkey while keeping a soft background. And then my primary focus was on the one moment where I was hoping that it would actually hold the phone in a human way, because in 99% of the times it was actually holding the phone in a completely weird way, where you could easily tell that this monkey didn't know what it was and didn't know how to hold a phone. So it was holding it underwater, sideways, backwards, diagonally. There was only one moment where it held it like this. So that's when I took this shot. And in the end, I was surprised that no one else got it, because I have seen other shots from other photographers who were there, and they were all different from this. No one had a shot that looked like this. They all had shots with monkey holding the phone in a not human way. So that tells me that they were not waiting for that one moment. Yeah, apart from that, this is not my favorite snow monkey shot at all, because if I'm honest, this is just pure luck. This is not something that I could have pre-visualized. So there's other shots that I like more. This I think is more creative, because again, I used off-camera flash here. So I like this much better. I also like the fact that they all have their eyes closed. They're really enjoying being inside the hot spring. So that's why I like this one better. This one also similar. I have created my own light again. This is also off-camera flash. It's very nice, tranquil scene. This monkey is basically sleeping. It almost looks like he fell asleep at the while working on his laptop. That's how it looks to me. That's what I really enjoy. And this is one of my most recent images. Again, tiger, photographed the same location. The reason I included this is to show that it doesn't always have to be spectacular. There's nothing quite spectacular. There's nothing quite spectacular with this image. It's in the center of the frame, which is usually frowned upon. It's walking straight at us. There's nothing spectacular in the image itself. It's just grass, soft background, and very nice light. But it does show what it does for an image if you choose the perfect angle. Picking the right angle is so important for a wildlife photographer, because you can shoot the same subject from 100 different angles, but there's always going to be one that's significantly better than all the other ones. And I happen to think that this is probably the best angle that I picked for this tiger.
I think it's centered position and right walking into the towards you is making the difference.
Yeah, I think it's something is walking straight at you. That's
Yeah.
a good reason to have it centered. You know, there's a
Yeah.
couple of reasons to do that.
Yeah.
Something running at you, or if something is almost symmetrical, like the
Yeah.
polar bear image that I showed you, or the crane image, those are symmetrical solutions. So I think that they work best if it's centered.
Right.
I wanted to include 2 black and white images because I always enjoy black and white also. This was in South Georgia. This is actually a male elephant seal on top of a female elephant seal. Both are adults, but the male tends to be extremely large compared to the female. So it already gives a very strange feel to it. And
Yeah.
I just liked how this worked, because in real life, these animals have hardly any color, and the background is very green. Those hills in the background were green, and green can be a horrible color because it can be very dominant, just like blue from a blue sky. So that's the reason here why I turned it into black and white.
Right.
And the second image is also from South Georgia, and I've seen tons of images from here. They're almost always in color, mostly focusing on the penguins that you see in the background here. But here I focused my attention on a very, very little story that was happening here. And if you're here, it's very hard to focus because it's very noisy, because there's a couple of 100,000 penguins and there's so much wildlife everywhere. It's literally difficult to not step on the wildlife. So to focus on what's happening is really hard. So I'm very pleased that I found this tiny little scene where this young seal was interested in this tiny little white feather. And that's the story here. So even though it's very small, I think it's very clear and your eye goes straight there. And then the last image I wanted to show is actually the last image that I processed. So this is also from my last trip before I got locked up here in South Africa in lockdown. This was in Kenya. We were scouting for our photo tour in Kenya. And I was photographing rhinos. Rhinos are fascinating animals, difficult to photograph, not the most photogenic. They're very large, but they're always like in difficult habitats. Here I was lucky to get a very nice background. I got myself in a good angle. And nowadays, unfortunately, it's also rare to find a rhino with such a nice large horn. So that's one of the things that any wildlife photographer will appreciate an image like this, to see a rhino with such a large horn. And then light situation is very good. And the ears both pointing upwards, which is extremely difficult with rhinos. They usually move their ears constantly all over the place, which I don't like so very much. So I'm constantly hoping. When I'm looking through the viewfinder, this is literally my main focus. I'm constantly looking at the ears, just waiting for them to both be upright and pointing towards me. So yeah, so that's basically all my images. Took me a long time. It's because I talk too much. But I hope you enjoyed that.
Oh yeah, it's kind of the journey that we've gone through with your own narrative against every image that you've been sharing, and so open about sharing your thought process, the way you use the equipment and the way what goes on in your mind was phenomenal. Yeah.
Thank you. Happy you enjoyed it.
Certainly, yeah. Anybody wants to? So
we did.
I think so. Gush is with us today, Marsel. So Gurch is actually attending through YouTube streaming, and he
oh no.
and we have Daniela as well, who claims to be your light mistress.
She is, yes.
Gurch has a question for you, and I think that's a good one, right? Because you travel so extensively. How many times do you scout and recce a place before you take anybody else for a workshop?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm a little bit disappointed because I was expecting Gurj to ask me a very silly question to make me laugh, but a serious question is also good. It really depends on the location, because typically we try to always scout before we're going to run a tour, but for some areas it takes more scouting. So for instance, the images that I showed you at the beginning of the swamps, that took us 2 years to scout before we were able to do a tour there, because it was just too complicated in terms of the logistics, but also in terms of the landscape there was just very hard to figure it all out. The Namibia was also a complicated tour, also a lot of logistics, a lot of places. So that also took us more than one time, but usually it's one time. And there's a few places where we make an exception, where we don't scout, because we know that it's not going to make a difference, because we already know what we're going to find there. Usually those are places that where you have basically zero influence as a photographer. You just have to take it as you just have to take what you get. Now, but as I explained earlier, I'm a wildlife photographer, but I think like a landscape photographer, I like to control as many variables during any shoot. So that can only mean that you scout, because only if you scout, you know beforehand what are the best places to go, where do you want to photograph that animal. If you don't scout, you don't know all the places, and then you don't know where you are going to photograph them.
All right. Yeah, that's interesting. Has it been there any time that you thought that that you could do away with the scouting or the recce at all and rely on a photographer, an expert photographer in that particular area, and lead the tour with him? Have you ever done that?
I would in those rare circumstances, like I outlined before, I would feel comfortable, but I would really need to have a very good reason for myself to do so, just because I know that not only for myself, but it's just going to be so much more productive for myself. But if I'm leading tours, I want to be able to tell my guests, like, okay, we're going to this location now, and I know from experience that you should all move over there because that's going to be the best. So if, for instance, if we go on an Antarctica trip, I have been to all those landing sites many times before. And if you go on a regular tour, they will tell you that it's a nice landing site and what kind of animals you can find there. But I can also tell my guests that they should skip the first penguin colony and they should walk straight to the last one, because that's the nicest one for photography. And I think that's part of my job also, to be able to do that. If I don't do the scouting first, then I can't help anyone in that sense. I want to be able to tell people, you need to be there. If you want to get the best light, this is going to be your best option. And then people are still free to ignore my advice. You know, doesn't matter. But I prefer it that way than hearing afterwards that they missed a very big opportunity because they didn't know that there was something much more beautiful on the other side of the mountain.
Absolutely. I think in this case, you are probably, if you don't do that, then you're relying on somebody else's vision, which might not match with your own vision.
Also that, yes. Yeah, I have a very specific way of looking at the world, and I have my own style, and I have my own aesthetic preferences. So when I walk into a landscape, I'll most likely walk into a different direction than another photographer. And when people choose me to go to join a trip with, that means that they like my style of photography. So that means that they should that they should hear what are the best locations from me instead of from another photographer or from some of those photography ebooks that you get online.
There is a question on YouTube by Prasad Ambati. She's asking that I find in most of your shots the reaction time is so less. How do you get the composition right? Is it any kind of practice you do in mind?
So, so this is about wildlife photography, right? About compositions, yeah. Well, to be honest, a lot of times you actually don't have a choice because you're in a certain spot, and then when something suddenly happens, the only thing you usually can do is frame. So you can't change your viewpoint much because you're usually in a car or you're in a hide, or so you have to make all your decisions usually from a fixed spot. So that leaves two things. You can decide on your focal length. That's one thing you can do, and you can decide on your framing. But the one thing that you should train yourself in as a wildlife photographer is to constantly try to be one step ahead of what you're looking at. So if you're shooting one thing, you always have to run through a couple of alternative scenarios. Like I mentioned earlier, look at don't look only at the framing that you have at that moment, but also think about, what if the animal suddenly starts to move to the right? What's going to happen? And then you look to the right and you see, oh, the landscape looks totally different there. Actually, the light is different there. That means that you already know that you can't just point your camera to the right when the animal starts walking to the right. You also have to make adjustments to your exposure. And so there's a ton of little decisions you have to always make when something suddenly happens. And your success is totally dependent on how fast you can think and how fast you can change your settings on your camera. You can be very poor at your camera technique and be a very good landscape photographer because you have a ton of time. You can think a very long time about what you need to do. But with wildlife, it's just like bang. It's everything is different. So you have to be like and change it. And this is something that you can train. So I advise people to train that. But for composition, the only thing you can do is try to think into the future and be prepared for what's going to happen.
Right. Yeah, wonderful answer. And there's another question by Anand that I also wanted to ask. But Anand Sachdeva is that, have you ever tried underwater, or do you have any plans of trying underwater?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've never tried underwater, and I am never going to try underwater. I think it's fair to say for me that this is a certainty. Although nothing is certain in life, the reason is twofold. One of the reasons is I feel very uncomfortable under the water. I don't like being under the water. I feel like it's not where I'm supposed to be. I'm a mammal. I'm supposed to be walking or sitting or running, not swimming underwater. That's one reason. And the other reason is as an aesthetic reason, which is the most important reason. And it's actually the reason for most of my decisions on where I photograph. And it's that the fact that everything underwater for me looks the same. Everything is blue. So the surroundings are blue, the backgrounds are blue. There's no mountains in the background. There's nothing if there's something in the background, it's usually another species of the same kind, if you're lucky. But most of the time for me, it's just a portrait shot of some animal in blue light. And although I can appreciate good underwater photography, I have watched Blue Planet, and I was amazed by the incredible biodiversity underwater, which is actually much larger than the animal world above water, which pales in comparison to everything that happens underwater. Yeah. But still, from what I'm seeing, I miss the depth, I miss the habitat, I miss the scenery.
The layering also, yeah, that you create, and overlapping is you just can't avoid there because.
Yeah, it's probably the scenery that the scenery in combination with the bluishness. There's several reasons, but it doesn't it doesn't pull me yet. No.
Right. There's one question from Sarita Srinivasan. She's asking that how much does Daniela contribute to the planning and conceiving these photos and help you in your thought process? Does she also click?
Okay, I'll start with the last question. She does also take photographs, but she doesn't use like what I call a proper camera. So she photographs everything with her phone, with her iPhone. And she's very good at that, I must say. She has obviously learned a lot also over the years, not only from me, but also from our guests, because we do a lot of image reviews during our tours. So that means that she sees not only my images, but also from all our guests that have been taken in the same locations. She has seen my composition presentation many times. So over the years, she's become very good. And so good, actually, that when we're scouting together, I'm usually going one way, Daniela goes another separate way, and she just takes photographs with her phone. And then either she WhatsApps her photographs to me, or she shows them later. And then on many occasions, I see something that she photographed with her iPhone, and I think, oh wow, this would look great with a 14mm or something. So then I use her visual feedback basically as my personal scout. And then the first question was regarding the planning. Daniela is critical for the planning. That already started in our advertising life, because I was an art director when I was in advertising. My Daniela was an account director. So she was responsible for client relations and for planning. And that's also part of her DNA, in the same way that my creativity is part of my DNA, which is why we make such a good couple. We are opposites in many ways, but with 1 and 1 is 3. So whenever we need to do anything that's planning related, I must admit that like 99% rests on her shoulders, and I would not be able to do what I do without her contribution.
I think I have tasted that yesterday. The bit on the immaculate planning that she does, and the eye that she keeps for the minutest things that are happening around, and while she's planning. So I have a kind of in a way I can say that I have experienced this firsthand. So Daniela will know what I'm.
Well, so for our tours, for instance, people always the first time people join on our tours is always the same reason. It's always because they want to learn from me. They want to travel with me to photograph a certain location or a certain subject. But usually when they're on the tour, that's when they realize that our tours are perfectly organized, because both Daniela and myself are perfectionists. We are control freaks. So I'm a control freak in all the creative part, But Daniela is a control freak in her line of work. So everything that's planning is also run to perfection. And the people don't know that when they go on the first tour. So usually they keep coming back because they realize that Daniela is actually a nicer person than I am, and she's also better at planning. So yeah, so that's how it works. Yeah.
We heard a big thank you from behind.
Okay, good. I know she's watching, so I have to choose my words very carefully.
So can I ask you a silly question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So throughout this whole session, we by the end of it, we know pretty clearly that you plan everything meticulously, including your wife. So why the?
I don't plan my wife.
No. Including your wife, she also plans it. So
if only I could plan her.
So my question is, why the fit for an autopsy T-shirt?
The fit for an autopsy T-shirt.
Okay,
So
that's a silly question, huh? Not one.
Are you familiar with the band?
Yes.
No, I'm not.
Yeah. No. Okay. So yeah. So one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that I like very extreme music. So that's that's death metal basically. So it's very, very extreme. Most people can't listen to it longer than 10 seconds, and then they already get very nervous. But it's what I like very much, and I have a lot of bands that I listen to, and this is just one of them. I like to buy T-shirts from the bands that I listen to. It's one of the ways to support the bands, because usually they don't make a lot of money selling their music. They make more money selling their merchandise, especially the kind of music that I listen to, because if you were to go on Spotify and then go to Fit for an Autopsy and listen to their music, you will realize very quickly that it's not mainstream music, and then that they won't have millions of fans. So yeah, that's one of the reasons. And I like the shirt. I love photography. Again, I'm a trained graphic designer, so I like typography very much, and I happen to like this T-shirt. So not such a silly question after all.
Okay, I thought it will be a silly question. So how does music influence your work?
That's a very good question. I would say it doesn't influence my creative part very much, but it does inspire me, and it helps keep me sane, and it develops my brain. So how I would like to explain that is that over the years I've come to learn a lot about myself, how my brain works, and I have learned that what I really like is organize things. The way my brain works is I like to create order from chaos. This is a relatively young insight. It's only from the last 20 years that I started to realize that that's how I work. So that explains why I like graphic design very much, because in graphic design, that's what you're doing. You're creating order from chaos. It also explains why I love photography very much, because again, I'm creating order from chaos. The landscape is a chaos. It's up to the photographer to create some sort of order that's both pleasing and rational, and that makes sense. My music falls into that same category. The instrument that I play is the drums. The drums, again, is the same thing. It's order from chaos. Drums is very difficult because you have to play it with all your 4 limbs. And when you just hit something, it results in nothing. It is only when you hit everything at exactly the same time when it starts to make sense. Even with a piano, you can just mess around and it will make, and you will be able to create some sort of melody, even if you know nothing about a piano. You spend 2 seconds and you figure out, oh, these are 3 nice tones. With drums, not so much. And the same is for my music. What I like so much about my music is that it's very difficult for the brain to process, because there's a lot of things going on. It's the melody is, typical melody goes like this, very high tones, very low tones. That makes melody very easy to remember. That makes pop music easy to sing while you're in the shower, because it's catchy. In my music, the melody goes like this. The tones are very close to each other. So there's very little difference between the tones. And then the speed is like, it's like light speed. So it goes super fast. And then there's just a lot of it, and it's distorted. So if you're an untrained ear, all you hear is noise. But if you have a trained ear, you'll be able to hear all the different layers, and you'll be able to make sense of it. But even for me, even though I have trained ears, when I listen to a new band, I had never listened to the song before, it will also be intimidating, and I'll just be like, whoa, that's a wall of sound. And then it started becoming more interesting to me. Then I listened to it again, and then it's like analyzing. That's what it is, analyzing music. And I like to analyze things. That's also why I like the pre-visualizing part so much. It's like why I like preparing for a trip. It's why I like coming up with ideas before I start photographing. It's because I like analyzing. So I analyze the problem and I come up with a solution. And everything that I do is basically that.
That's fantastic. That's quite an insight.
Awesome.
I had just, though we are already closing to 3 hours, but still, there's a small question that I have. That now you were an art director and you were into a different field altogether, and that kind of influenced your thought process in photography. Now, do you also see the photography changing your life in a way, or something, influencing the way you live your life, lead your life in some way or the other?
Oh, at first I thought your question was going to in a different direction, whether I was seeing photography changing in general. For myself, well, clearly I see myself changing in what I do, because I see that my preferences, my visual preferences are changing, especially now with the coronavirus. Now that I've been locked up since March, as with most photographers, we're suddenly in our house much more. We suddenly have a lot of time for stuff that we usually don't have time for. And also for me, it means that I'm going through my folders in Lightroom, and I'm visiting folders that I've never even visited before. And some of them are as old as 2011 or 2013. These are folders I've never had the time to open, or maybe even briefly. And now I'm going through those folders and I'm looking at the selections I have made. And to my astonishment, I have seen now that the selections I have made, so the images that I've given a star rating, I'm going through all the images, and I see a lot of images that are really good, but they don't have a star. So that means that at the time that I shot the images, I thought those images were actually not good at all. They were not even worthy of a single star. And that image that I showed you of the lemur that was hanging on the branch is one of those images. It did not have a single star. And vice versa, the images that I did get stars to, I had to think really hard about why the hell did I give a star to this image and to that image. I just couldn't understand. I was looking at it, I was like, okay, the light is bad, background is bad, angle is not good. So clearly we are all changing. Not only me, I'm sure that all of you guys
Everybody.
are witnessing something similar. But it just made me realize a couple of things, that I shouldn't be too eager throwing stuff away.
Yeah.
Because I might actually love it a little bit later on. And also it made me see what direction I'm actually moving in. So I'm moving from more subject-oriented into more habitat-oriented, and from more action-oriented towards more light-oriented, and from more extroverted images towards more introverted, where the sentimental value of the image is much more subtle. So not so more an animal roaring, but more like an animal like enjoying itself, or sleeping, or something like this. I'm sure this is another phase that I will grow out of, and that's what keeps this very interesting. You know, it's you're never finished. It's not a science.
Right.
Yeah.
I think such a wonderful answer. And anybody wants to ask anything, or we wind up, because it's
a closing question from me. You know, you put such a huge impetus on composition and the uniqueness of the final output, the amount of pre-visualization that you do. One of the things that I personally see in modern photography is that people shooting the same subject over and over again, just with different workflow, different light, different colors. And obviously wildlife probably produces more opportunities to click something unique, but landscape has finite possibilities. But even then, I think most photographers do not make the effort to create something unique. That's what I've seen. Now, what are your views around that? Because you come across as somebody where I could take off Photoshop, I could take off Instagram, and you'd still be as happy shooting your subjects. And that's what makes us fall in love with your work. You're not shooting for the workflow, you're not shooting for social media, you're doing it to create art.
Yeah, well, I can only say that I'm very pleased that you mentioned that, because it's absolutely true. Yeah, if Instagram were to die tomorrow, I would not lose a second of sleep, as opposed to a lot of people, like actually a lot of photographers, they have everything. Their whole life is social media, or their whole life is Instagram, and they would almost cease to exist. But the other thing that you mentioned is that I've lost my line of thought.
Photoshop.
You need to get me back one step.
Is it about Photoshop? Is it, so your focus on composition and light versus post-processing is what I was talking about.
Yeah, no, so post-processing for me is very important, but it's not my main focus. So you know, you have to realize that when I was still working in advertising and working with other photographers, there was a lot of post-processing going on in advertising, because nothing in advertising is real. You know, everything is fake. Everything looks better than the real world. And that's why it's advertising. We want to show things that are actually nicer than they are. So I've grown up in that world. So we were already doing image manipulation before Photoshop. We worked on a machine called Paintbox, which was basically Photoshop before Photoshop. And we were doing the same thing. We were cloning, and we were doing HDR. We were doing putting all kinds of different elements together. Most of the car photography we did, I would photograph the car in the studio, the landscape in a different country, and we would merge them together. So I grew up with image manipulation. So I knew already what is possible and how to do it, how to think like that. So those were all things that are still very useful to me. However, I also started to resent that during my advertising career. The fact that everything is possible when in your work from a creative point of view, literally whatever I came up with as an advertising idea, whatever I sketched on my piece of paper, once the client approved it, we were going to make it. And whatever it took. And after a while, I felt myself drawn more to nature photography because it felt more real. I lived in that world of fake, of make-believe. And I felt like I preferred that world where everything was natural and not so over-processed. And so in many ways, what I do now is a reaction to what I did in my previous career. However, that said, even though I prefer my images to have a natural look, I do think that post-processing is extremely important. The example I always give is that of a chef. So a chef can be a good chef, and what he will always do is try to get the best ingredients. So he will buy the best fish he can buy. He will buy the best vegetables he can buy. He will cut it with the best knife. But in the end, it is the presentation, it's the sauces, and it's the herbs and the spices that you use to make it your own. If you don't use any herbs and spices and you don't do anything about the presentation, your cooked or grilled fish is going to be exactly the same as the grilled fish from the other chefs. So this is how I think that post-processing is important, because that's how you make it your own. So I try to get the look that I want as much as possible in camera, but then once I'm home, that's when I really try to make it like different, more me. And in a lot of cases, I am already in the field, whether it's landscape or wildlife, and I already realize that what I'm looking at is not something that I like. I already know that what I'm photographing has potential, but it's not what I want. And then immediately in the field, I start thinking about alternative ways to solve this problem. And most of the times, those solutions are post-processing solutions. So that means that in the field, I already have to think about what do I need to be able to solve this problem when I'm back at home. So sometimes that means that I have to shoot different exposures. Even when I'm shooting an elephant, I need maybe also shoot it as an HDR. Maybe if there's something super distracting in the background, I need to clone it out, I may need to actually shoot a separate background that's just to the left of me, but outside of the frame. So I can use it as cloning material for the background. So this is something I learned in advertising. So that it's an immediate process. I see it, I know this is what I need to do. So if you're not used to that, that's going to be hard. And then you have to fully rely on post-processing. But I try to do it both. So try to get it right in the location, and then already think about what I need to do to process it perfectly afterwards. And then the rest is just an artistic process where sometimes I have to add that I'm super slow. So when I process, it takes me a lot of time. Very often I process only one image a day. And even then it's not finished, because then the next morning I open it and I think, what the hell? No, what did I do? And then I start all over again. And then even then I don't post it. I just leave it somewhere on a hard drive. And then I look at it again a couple of days later. And it isn't until I think that, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's when I'm happy with it. And then I share it. Yeah. I don't know if that's an answer to your question. I talk too much.
It does. I think, yeah.
Thank you, Marsel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Anybody else? Otherwise, we wind up. There's one small last thing that Anand is asking on YouTube, that any single line tip for your ardent follower photographers?
Well, that would be to to start thinking about what I just explained about my own thought process. So try to get to the bottom of who you are and what makes you tick. because most people don't spend a single second thinking about that. And what happens then is that you're basically responding to what you're seeing on social media. So you go on Instagram, you follow a couple of photographers that you really like, and then you look at which one is very popular, and then you see, oh, this image gets 1 million likes, and then you think, I would like 1 million likes. And then you see another image, and it also has 1 million likes, and you think, hey, that image looks a little bit like that other image that I saw that also had 1 million likes. You know, what if I start making images that look a little bit like those images? Then maybe I also get 1 million likes. And before you know it, you're going to be so influenced by everything you're seeing on social media that you're going to be following basically all kinds of fashions on the internet, and you're going to be imitating other photographers. So my tip would be to figure out who you are, what you like, and then develop your own style from that and stick to that. Stay close to yourself and don't become a follower, because if you do that, no one's going to notice you.
So true.
Yeah, so true. I think that's the best tip that anybody could ever give. And
I saw one of your podcasts with Enrico, and Enrico is actually a very good example. Even Ryan, actually. Ryan and Enrico do something, they process the images very dark, and that's just something that they like, and I appreciate that, because that's close to them. That's what they prefer, and they stick to it. You know, everything Enrico produces, it's dark, and they realize that there must be a ton of people who don't like it, but they don't care. That is the right attitude. If you're an artist, you should not care. The only person you should care about is yourself. So you only need to make yourself happy. And when you make yourself happy, continue to do that. And then you'll soon be recognized by other people that love the kind of work that you do. Don't go all over the place doing tons of different things. It'll be confusing to yourself, and it will be confusing to the people that are following you.
Fantastic. One of the finest sessions that we have in long time, I think. Thank you so much, Marsel, for really such an insightful presentation and such insightful answers that you've been giving to all the questions. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah. So I think so. We wind up, and as a customary wind up, so we have one screen selfie that I'll take. So everybody smiles and everybody puts the thumbs up, and let me take the selfie, except me, because I'm holding. So anyways, so bye. That was awesome, and thank you, Daniela, for, I think, the behind the scene kind of coordination that she probably was doing and managing things. And so it was phenomenal. Let me repeat this, and we are going to repeat this for umpteenth number of times that we ever think of this session. And amazing. Thank you so much, and hope to.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for taking the time to listen to me. I realize that this is quite long. So
long is as far
long
as
doesn't matter. It was very
we enjoyed every
and
bit of it.
we enjoyed it.
Like we said,
good to hear.
content is king. Content is king.
Content is king. Yeah.
It was very inspiring.
These kinds of talks and discussions are priceless, and they should never be bound by the boundaries of time also, because you would want to continue talking. What else do we have to do in this lockdown?
This is what we intended from the day one when we started this. What goes on the photographer's mind when they click, what they create, what is the process and everything. And everybody who is there on YouTube or whoever is watching later on, they always wanted to know that, because not everybody is lucky enough to meet you guys and discuss things with you, even on even the Facebook, Instagram. So that was what we intended from day one, to bring you guys to them. At least tried. till now.
No, and I think it's good. I'm happy that you're doing this because, as a matter of fact, when I'm processing my images, I tend to listen to a lot of podcasts. They're never about photography, but also always about like politics or philosophy or stuff. And a lot of those podcasts are actually super long. So one of my favorite podcasters makes podcasts that are often 3 hours long, and I'm never bored a single second. So once you're interested in a certain subject or in a certain person you like to listen to, it actually makes sense to make it long, and especially on YouTube, because you can just stop it and continue the next time.
Yeah.
So good on you to do this, like the way that you do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And good night.
Yeah. Bye. And
Bye-bye. Stay safe, everyone.
All right.
Stay safe.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank
Good.
you. Bye.
All right.
Take care.
Okay.
Have a
Bye-bye, guys.
wonderful time.
Bye.
Okay.